As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now I said that one main purpose of Plato's whole philosophy was to answer the sophists, to show that objective knowledge is possible. But here we immediately have a question. How can we ever come to know the forms? After all, they constitute a completely different world, a non-material world, and as such, not in space, not in time. And yet here are we on Earth, limited by our bodies and our senses. How are we ever to come in contact with them? Well, of course, Plato answers by thought. But the question is, how does thought down here ever come in contact with the forms up there? And of course, up and down are here simply metaphors because the forms aren't anywhere. They're not spatial. Well, the answer to this we have already actually touched on last week. We proved, at least in Plato's opinion last week, that we must have been in contact with the world of forms prior to this life. We must have lived in the world of forms in a preceding life. And Plato believes that he's proved that, and therefore adopts intact the whole orthic Pythagorean view with the wheel of birth, successive reincarnations, and the ultimate goal being escape. But in any event, our souls knew all the forms, and therefore all the laws, and therefore was actually omniscient prior to its birth in this world. When, however, it was immersed in the body and thrust into the Heraclitean flux, it had what modern psychologists would call a birth trauma. And the effect of that is the soul forgot all the things that it knew. Put in modern terms, all that knowledge descended into the unconscious. But it is still there. It is still in us. It's still real. What we call acquiring knowledge, says Plato, is really not acquiring new knowledge at all. It simply is a process of digging out from your subconscious or unconscious what is really already there. Knowledge is a process of remembering, of reminiscence. And this is Plato's famous theory of knowledge as reminiscence. And it's in Greek the theory of anamnesis, N-E-S-I-S. Anamnesis simply means reminiscence. Therefore, for Plato, there is definitely innate knowledge, knowledge of reality born in us. The senses, the physical senses, are not means of getting new knowledge of reality. What then is their function? Does Plato believe that if you took a young baby and gouged out his eyes and pierced his ears and generally mutilated his senses, he would then be able to go along merrily and still remember the forms? No. Plato says, yes, we definitely need the senses in the early stages of knowledge. Not to teach us something new, however, but to serve as a stimulus to jog our memories. The best analogy you can think of, the one I was taught when I was first taught Plato, is imagine that you 20 or 30 or 40 years after you have left college, you come across an old faded yearbook with pictures of your classmates. And your grandson is busy jostling it back and forth, so you get only a fleeting glimpse of a faded photograph. Now, if you didn't know the man in the photograph from 20, 30, 40 years back, you'd never get anything from that little stimulus. But given that you knew the man well, even if you have forgotten him completely, that corrupt, imperfect, flickering stimulus is enough to remind you, and you say, oh yes, Jones, I remember him, I haven't thought of him for years. Well, for Plato, in essence, that's true of all knowledge. You see a few horses and you say, ah yes, horseness, now it comes back to me. But after an initial period of thus stimulating your memories, knowledge thereafter is a matter of looking inward, not of looking outward. It is a matter of turning away from the world of introspection, because we have in us all the basic truths and laws and concepts, and what we do is simply look in, find them, and proceed to deduce their consequences logically, quite apart from any further sensory observation. Now, this view of knowledge, as you know, is called rationalism. But now, with Plato, we have a fully worked out answer to the question you asked several times before: how does reason operate if it doesn't base itself on sensory data? Heraclitus and Parmenides and those early figures were rationalists, but if you had asked them that question, they have no answer. Plato has an answer. His answer is reason is capable of acquiring knowledge apart from the senses because we are born with innate ideas. Now, from the time of Plato on, rationalism therefore acquires a fuller definition. It becomes the epistemological theory that knowledge is acquirable solely by reasoning from innate concepts, and that sense perception is in principle dispensable, except, of course, as a stimulus. It's called rationalism, of course, because Plato called the faculty which studied universals reason. It's the idea that reason alone can give you knowledge apart from the senses. Now, I should say for accuracy that this definition of rationalism holds true descriptively of philosophers in this camp up to the 18th century. Kant introduced in the 18th century a quite different version of rationalism, a variation on Plato, but nevertheless a significantly different one. And rationalism from the 18th century to the present is quite different and does not believe in innate ideas. But that's not the subject of this course.
So Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Sunday rejected the idea of the U.S. calling for a ceasefire in Gaza when confronted with the massive number of child casualties in Israel's onslaught. So this was during an interview on CBS News on Face the Nation, and Margaret Brennan, who is the host, asked Blinken, quote, UNICEF says 1,524 children have been killed in the Gaza Strip during these bombings. Why isn't the U.S. calling for at least a temporary ceasefire, end quote. So Blinken replied, claiming that the death of children on both sides hits him right in the heart, but he did not criticize Israel's vicious bombing campaign. He pointed to the U.S. effort to get Israel to allow aid trucks to enter Gaza through Egypt. And Brennan then asked why the U.S. is not pushing for at least a temporary ceasefire. She pressed the question again, and Blinken said, quote, Israel has to do everything it can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Freezing things in place where they are now would allow Hamas to remain where it is and to repeat what it's done sometime in the future. No country could accept that, end quote. So it sounds like a familiar argument because Blinken made a similar case earlier this year when rejecting the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. He said then that a pause in fighting would only benefit Russia. And we know from the Discord leaks and other reports at the time that U.S. officials knew before Ukraine launched its counteroffensive that they wouldn't gain any significant territory. But Blinken pushed for it anyway. So, it seems like in every conflict that the U.S. is involved in, Blinken is always against the idea of a ceasefire. He's against the idea of peace. And now, looking back, it's clear that at this point, Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed despite months and months of brutal fighting, which is still going on. I know I haven't been covering it much lately, but there's still been a lot of fighting along the front, and Ukraine has taken very heavy casualties. So back to the interview that he did on Sunday, Blinken also claimed that it was Hamas's fault that American citizens in Gaza could not leave, despite the fact that the enclave is under an Israeli blockade, and Israel actually closed its border crossing and is not letting people in. So this is a new one. I have not heard the U.S. blame Hamas for people not being able to leave Gaza, and this is specifically about Americans, Palestinian Americans in Gaza, dual citizens. Blinken said, quote, we've had people come to Rafah, the crossing with Egypt, and to date, at least, Hamas has blocked them from leaving, showing once again its total disregard for civilians of any kind who are stuck in Gaza. So really, the ball is in Hamas's court in terms of letting people who want to leave, civilians from third countries, including Americans, get out of Gaza, end quote. So again, this seems like a completely false claim. I was looking at reports in recent days that have spoken with Palestinian Americans or citizens of other countries, and they were told to go to the Rafah border crossing, but they were not allowed into Egypt. There's no indication that they're saying Hamas is preventing them from leaving. Looks like Blinken is just trying to deflect the blame here. And you hear the talking points from the hawks in Congress. They're saying Biden's not doing anything to get the hostages out of, the American hostages that were taken from Israel, who are likely dual citizens as well. As far as I know, they all are. But anyway, this NBC report, they spoke with Palestinian Americans at the Rafah border crossing who said, the U.S. isn't helping us, Biden's not helping us, the embassy's not helping us. They're not getting any help when it comes to getting out of Gaza. And here you have Blinken blaming it on Hamas. So the full package that the White House has asked Congress to authorize is worth $105 billion, and that includes $61.4 billion for Ukraine. The idea is to get through the 2024 election. Israel will receive $14.3 billion in assistance, with $10.6 billion for air and missile defense support. The aid would be in addition to the $3.8 billion that Israel receives each year. The bill includes $7.4 billion for several initiatives to increase Washington's military posture in the Indo-Pacific. That includes $2 billion for foreign governments to buy American weapons, and Taiwan is going to receive some of those billions. I'm not sure exactly how much. So money to fund Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. All military aid, all to fuel ongoing hot wars, and then the aid for Taiwan is just going to increase tensions with China. Israel threatens to wipe Iran off the face of the earth if Hezbollah intervenes. So an Israeli official has vowed that Iran would be wiped off the face of the earth if Hezbollah opens up a northern front for Israel. So Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire along the Lebanon-Israel border since the October 7th Hamas attack. There have been dozens of casualties, mainly on the Lebanon side, but Hezbollah has not launched a major assault on Israel yet. Still just exchange of fire across the border. So there has been some, I think, incursions into Israel from the Palestinian groups that are in the refugee camps in southern Israel. But as far as I know, there's been no big Hezbollah, ground attack. So Nir Barkat, who's Israel's Minister of Economy, he told the Mail on Sunday that if Hezbollah enters the war, Israel would not only eliminate the group, but would also target Iran. He said, quote, "The plan of Iran is to attack Israel on all fronts. If we find they intend to target Israel, we will not just retaliate to those fronts, but we will go to the head of the snake, which is Iran," end quote. So his warning comes as an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza appears to be imminent. He went on, quote, "Lebanon and Hezbollah are going to pay a heavy price, similar to what Hamas is going to pay. But that's not enough. The very clear message is that we are going to be going after the heads of Iran as well. Israel has a very clear message to our enemies. We are saying to them, look, what's happening in Gaza, you are going to get the same treatment. If you attack us, we are going to wipe you off the face of the earth," end quote. So when it comes to Israeli threats against Iran, realistically, Israel does not have the capabilities to sustain a bombing campaign in Iran similar to what they're doing in Gaza without support from the U.S. And both Iran and Hezbollah have very formidable militaries. Israel had a really tough time against Hezbollah during the 2006 war. And they have very advanced missiles. It would be a lot for Israel to handle. But the thing is that Israel does have nuclear weapons. They have a secret nuclear weapons stockpile. So that makes threats like this, these aren't hollow threats. When you have an official with a nuclear armed state, the only nuclear armed state in the region, despite all the claims about Iran, they don't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does. So when they make threats like this, it could mean something.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
I do think that there's a relationship between government and public opinion, and that, yes, government will push forward as far as they can with, removing and stripping freedoms, but it's a game of what they can get away with. I think the most recent example would be when they tried doing that Orwellian, look over the internet with that Mary Poppins singing lady. And everyone was like, no, this is ridiculous. And so they go, we were never going to do that. And then people brought the records like, no, you were clearly trying to do that. No, we were never going to do that. I think January 6th is kind of the same way. If you even had people like civilians on the left going, this is ridiculous, that was just a civil protest and there's no reason for these people to go to jail, I don't think the FBI would have gotten away with as many resources put into it. But like the starting point is kind of, can the FBI spin the story to the American public that these people need to go to jail? And then can they push forward with it? And then can they put the people in jail? That's kind of why, now I'm ranting a little bit here, but that's kind of why they have the gag orders. And what they're doing with Donald Trump is that they kind of know that there is an element of public opinion. That's how Cosby ended up going to jail, was that public opinion kind of, or even Epstein, public opinion found out about the Epstein story, and then all of a sudden the Justice Department had to go, oh yeah, we're just as angry as you are, and now the guy's going to jail. So to me, there is an element of public opinion and what the government can get away with. I think that's why they're starting to de-escalate and maybe even walk away from the Ukraine war. And I think what the conservatives are saying is good. This is a lesson learning opportunity that if we're going to say that going in there's a flagrant offense, let's go do it. And then everyone's got to sit with the discomfort of, oh, I guess this isn't something that you should go to jail for. Maybe we should. Well,
I'm totally right. Fine with. If the goal is to like move the conversation to, even if you wanted to say in a way like, hey, do you really think all these people's lives should be ruined because they entered a sacred building with ceasefire signs? Is that really like right? And if that can make them kind of open their eyes to things, then yes. And I totally agree with you that, look, I mean, I think that's the essence of why I do what I do, is because I do believe that, like, if you can have an impact on public opinion, you can move the needle in a certain direction, and that, tyrannical governments can only really get away with what they're able to propagandize their own citizens to believe is acceptable. And if they don't have that belief in them, then their authority basically vanishes. So I agree with all of that. By the way, it is interesting. Just as you mentioned, it does seem like there is a possibility that this now will be the out to walk away from the Ukraine support. And isn't it funny how, the way all of this propaganda works and the way these insane like fear campaigns where, so for so long, right, as I've been probably, what has it been, at least a couple years of arguing about this Ukraine stuff. I've done several debates and talked about it on many, many, many podcasts. And so what have we heard from the other side? Well, if Vladimir Putin wins, then that's game over. Then he's going to invade Poland. He's going to reconstitute the Soviet Union. But even now, as it seems like we might be backing off of funding this war, and it seems inevitable that Vladimir Putin's going to win, watch hearing no talk of that. Like, watch. You're going to hear no one even talk about that. It's going to be as if they never even said it was true. Obviously, none of that's going to happen. And it'll just be like, oh, whatever. We're talking about Israel now, dude. Like, who cares about this shit? Isn't it kind of funny that it's like when there is no real concern right now out of the political class or the media class to be like, wait a minute, but we're walking away from Ukraine. This is going to be a disaster because now Vladimir Putin's going to invade Poland. Correct me if I'm wrong. Who do you see saying that?
Yeah, that would be the funner. That's like that's O.J. Simpson level lying right there. When you're like, I'm running the Howard Stern. I think asked him that question. How's the investigation going in for the actual killer? This is kind of like that, where it's like, wait, listen, the Gaza Strip, I get it's terrible, but we can't have Putin taking over all of Europe. So why is Biden even flying over there? Don't you should be flying back over to the Ukraine. I mean, Putin's about if you de-escalate, he's going to take over all of Europe.
I mean, I've been told pretty consistently for 2 years that that's what's going to happen here. And now, are we doing this now? Because I mean, it was pretty funny to just
let's not get distracted by some little situation in Gaza. Maybe a couple thousand civilians on each side. Putin's taking over Europe.
Jesus. What's his name? Douglas McKay, who was posting under the alias Ricky Vaughn, was sentenced to 7 months in federal prison over what they call, I mean, it's really just hilarious, what Politico calls his 2016 voter suppression scheme.
Right.
This is just, I mean, so goddamn appalling. So he tweeted, it was pretty goddamn funny too. He tweeted, avoid the lines, vote from home, text Hillary to 59925, just telling people that they could vote by text, which is obviously not a thing. But it seemed pretty clearly to just be a joke, kind of like mocking, like, wouldn't it be funny if we tricked all of the Hillary voters into not going and voting because they thought there was an easier way? And they came after this kid through the 7 months in federal prison for tweeting a joke. I am sorry, but we do not live in a free society when someone can be locked up for 7 months over that.
I guess there's a couple variables I'd be very curious to see. Now, obviously, it's appalling to me as a person who makes stupid jokes, might even make jokes that are sarcastic, and you might have thought I was giving you real information. I don't like this. Seems like a bad precedent. But one, I'd like to know how many people didn't end up voting on account of that tweet. Is there an actual number on it? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 100? I mean, if you're going to prosecute the guy, is there actual damages? Is there a single...
And for all of the people who ended up voting by text instead of voting, they were too stupid to be allowed to vote. Like, those people should not be allowed to vote.
I'd love to know technically. So what was this, like an election interference? Probably like what specifically was the problem? And then let's say we put the number at 5, 10, 100, 1,000. Let's say 1,000 people were tricked into not voting. If we were going to compare this to other things that happened during the election that persuade people to vote or fake votes or whatever, it's unbelievable amidst all the voter fraud claims that were seemingly not thoroughly investigated, or the ones I know for sure weren't thoroughly investigated, where the people were like, hey, I was working at this voting center and they told me there was lunch and then they locked me out. Like, if all of a sudden we're so careful about 5 votes, you see what I'm saying? Like, this is very clearly punishing individuals from only one side. And that's what just showcases the fact this is not a free country. What is going on here? We're not that concerned about voter fraud or voter manipulation. Why is this getting, like, I don't know, there's got to be some sort of a mechanism for policing that government doesn't just put particular individuals under a microscope.
Let's have a look at the kind of speech that's permissible and the kind of actions that are permissible and the kind of speech and actions that are not permissible. And where is the moral authority positioned right now? Who's making these decisions and who benefits from them? Let's have a look at a piece of news footage from the time of Douglas Mackey's arrest. And then we'll look at the context surrounding it and how this will be used as a precedent, presumably, to control free speech, to manipulate online social media discourse, and all of the other ways.
A notorious Twitter troll was arrested on federal charges of election interference. Douglas Mackey, also known by his online alter ego Ricky Vaughn, is accused of a voter disinformation campaign during the 2016 election. The arrest represents what could be a big change in how the federal government fights election interference.
Election interference versus propaganda versus manipulating outcomes. These are interesting grey areas. I suppose what we're discussing here is what Douglas Mackey did unique? And even in the actual context of jokes suggesting that there's a number where you can vote for Hillary Clinton, well, he wasn't alone in doing that. People on both sides were doing that. It was kind of understood to be a practical joke. And can you imagine the effect it had? And can you imagine the effect it had versus, for example, the Russiagate hoax or the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story 4 years later? Now, this relates to activity in 2016, of course, but that in itself was a time where this hysteria was beginning to escalate. And I think the pieces were being put in place to create what is now known as the censorship industrial complex. When you have people being imprisoned for posting memes, when there's no evidence that it influenced the outcome of the 2016 election, it sort of shows this appetite for centralization. It shows an appetite to shut down dissent, to control control dissidents, to punish dissidents, as well as more ideologically and perhaps abstractly, a refusal for the Democrat Party to accept that the reason people aren't voting for them is because they're the party of war, they're the party of lies, they're a party that don't deliver. We're not going to build a wall, we're building a wall, we're going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah, Saudi Arabia are not a pariah. When is there going to be a reckoning? When is it going to get beyond, this is the problem, these people cause the problem? When is there going to be some introspection and some meaningful change and some recognition of the very real corruption that's taking place within that particular organisation? Cases, as the New York Times reported at the time, was the first criminal case in the country involving voter suppression through the spread of disinformation on Twitter. Just popularising that idea of misinformation, just tying it to law, just enshrining it in real penalties so that information now can be qualified not on the basis of subjectivity but on the basis of objectivity and law. This information is verifiably and legally bad. This information is good. Here. Oh, that's interesting that this information basically says, let us get on with doing what we're doing, go and sit down quietly in your house, whereas this information was, be incredibly mistrustful of the system. The DOJ claimed that the meme from Mackey constituted election interference, and the court agreed, despite there being no evidence to support the notion that anyone who saw the meme was deceived by it. The complaint, the DOJ said in 2021, alleges that in 2016 Mackey established an audience on Twitter with approximately 58,000 followers. Mackey has been found guilty by a jury of his peers of attempting to deprive individuals from exercising their sacred right to vote for the candidate of their choice in the 2016 presidential election. Sacred. Sacred. Like it's an expression of divinity. It's an expression that there's like a God and that there's a oneness and there's a beauty. Where's that God and oneness and beauty in the advocacy for the ongoing wars that Hillary Clinton endlessly supported? Today's verdict proves that the defendant's fraudulent actions crossed the line into criminality and flatly rejects his cynical attempt to use the constitutional right of free speech as a shield for this scheme to subvert the ballot box and suppress the vote. Oh my God, it's a game. The whole thing's a game. No one's got any legitimacy anymore. Like, look at how that's actually written. Fraudulent actions cross the line into criminality and flatly rejects his cynical attempts to use the constitutional right of free speech. The right of free speech just means you can say stuff as long as that in itself isn't a crime or likely to lead to a crime. Was that a crime, him saying vote for Hillary by text when you can't vote for Hillary by text? Is it not more likely that some of the Russiagate stuff was influential? The problem I think we have right now is neither side, no side, and gosh, we've got to get beyond sides, are talking about personal culpability. When are we going to see like Hillary Clinton go, that Steele dossier thing, that was out of whack, and maybe the reason people didn't vote for me in 2016 is because again and again I've been shown to be an establishment politician that uses rhetoric about compassion, but when it comes to policy and action, favours the interests of powerful financial and military donor groups, and people just don't trust that anymore. And the reason a figure like Trump is so successful, I see that now, so he sounds like a normal person. It's a spiritual problem, I think, fundamentally at this point. Do you agree? Do you sort of see what I'm saying? It's like a spiritual issue more than a political one at this point. This decision to penalise Mackey opens a Pandora's box in examining repercussions of online behaviour. In an era increasingly shaped by social media, the contours of free speech and interference are blurred, yet it's imperative to remember that the blanket criminalisation of online content may inadvertently lead to the suppression of opinion and curb the creative liberties of citizens. It's not inadvertent, that is what's happening. It's deliberate and necessary because you can't maintain control where people have creative liberty. We're already seeing people kicked off the internet for what seem to be jokes, and now what's being suggested is a kind of deconditioning, a de-rigging of people that support Donald Trump. Pretty extraordinary and not that democratic, but should we be surprised? This is by Caitlin Johnston. This is, after all, the same woman who chortled with delight when she found out Muammar Gaddafi had been lynched in the streets following his US-led overthrow in Libya during her tenure as Secretary of State, saying, "I'm sure it did," when asked if his death had anything to do with her visit to the country.
We came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
The same woman who, as Secretary of State, promoted the plan of arming extremists in Syria with the goal of toppling Damascus. The same woman who, as a senator, played a pivotal role in convincing the Democratic Party to support the invasion of Iraq based on lies. The same woman who, as First Lady, said she urged her husband Bill Clinton to launch the bombing campaign that would leave Serbia and Kosovo covered in cluster munitions. The same woman who, as a US presidential candidate, advocated a no-fly zone in Syria, which would have required attacks on Russian warplanes who violated it, and endorsed the same brinkmanship policies in Ukraine which eventually provoked the Russian invasion. When Tulsi Gabbard famously dubbed Clinton the Queen of Warmongers in 2019, it wasn't just empty rhetoric. There is no woman alive who anyone could argue is more deserving of that title. Hillary Clinton is all the worst things about modern liberals and the Democratic Party. And yet, people wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton? You basket of deplorables. It must be election interference by that little lad with a few thousand Twitter followers, rather than that litany of horrific condemnations from that article by Caitlin Johnston.
James Madison is one of the best examples of this, and I want to cover his views today, starting out here with his take in the Philadelphia Convention. August 31st, 1787, the original Constitutional Convention. And here, Madison reaffirmed what was a totally undisputed view at the time of the founding, that all power comes from the people. They're at the top of the food chain. Here he is. The people were, in fact, the fountain of all power. And by resorting to them, it's a discussion over the mode of ratification. Some people, like Governor Morris, wanted to see each state determine whether it was going to be the state legislature ratifying or however they were going to propose it. But Madison insisted on going to a popular convention because then this would reaffirm the fact that it was the people of each state making those choices. He said, again, the people were in fact the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. It was a principle in the Bills of Rights that first principles might be resorted to. And of course, he's when he was 25 years old, he was a delegate to the 5th Virginia Convention in 1776, which gave us the Virginia Declaration of Rights, a foundation of so much more, many parts of the Bill of Rights, some of the Declaration of Independence, and the like. And here's from Section 2. All power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. Magistrates are their trustees and servants and are at all times amenable to them. And here again, Madison, in his speech introducing amendments to the Constitution. This is in June of 1789, his proposal for what he wanted to see, what became the Bill of Rights. But he wasn't proposing a separate Bill of Rights. He was proposing a block of amendments in the body of the Constitution primarily. And he put it this way: the amendments which have occurred to me proper to be recommended by Congress to the state legislatures are these. The first one that James Madison recommended is this. First, that there be prefixed to the Constitution a declaration that all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people. So this is Madisonian's, the Madisonian foundation of the Constitution, that the people, again, are at the top of the food chain. And he put it this way a little further in that speech: that government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists in the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That the people have an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform or change their government whenever it be found adverse or inadequate to the purposes of its institutions. And he said, this government, and this is that same speech, this government is not completely consolidated, nor is it entirely federal. Who are the parties to it? The people, but not the people as composing one great body. Now, some people had some issues. Of course, Patrick Henry had some issues with the notion of we the people, and he said, well, shouldn't it be we the states? And Madison is basically clarifying, we're not talking about the people as one unified national blob. We're talking about the people of the several states. Now, if you just say we the states, this could imply that, of course, it's the state governments that are at the top of the food chain. But Madison was reaffirming, again, that revolutionary principle that the people are at the top and they can alter or abolish as they decide. The people, but not the people as composing one great body, but the people as composing 13 sovereignties. He continued, should all the states adopt it, it will then be a government established by the 13 states of America, not through the intervention of the legislatures, but by the people at large. The existing system, which was an issue for them, has been derived from the dependent derivative authority of the legislatures of the states, whereas this is derived from the superior power of the people. Madison sounds like a radical to many of us today. Wow, the people can do whatever the heck they want is ultimately what he's saying. But there's a caveat to Madison's views here. And again, this is in June 11th, 1788. The people at large are the common superior of the state governments and the general government. So it should come as no surprise that in Federalist number 46, when Madison was talking about, and the title of this one is the influence of the state and federal governments compared. So January of 1788. But it should come as no surprise that Madison in Federalist number 46, when he's talking about how to deal with federal overreach, of course, there was a lot of arguments that, well, the feds are just going to run right over the states. And in Federalist 46, he points out, well, they may try, but there's a way to stop them. And it doesn't have anything to do with relying on the federal government to somehow magically limit its own power. It's the people of the several states that can get this done. The people themselves in conjunction with the state governments. So here's how he put it early on in that paper. The federal and state governments are in fact but different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. And again, he has to remind the people that the ultimate authority, wherever the derivative may be found, resides in the people alone. And he talks about this, his concern about popular passion, factions, the power of the majority. And he said, in all cases where a majority are united by common interests or passion, the rights of the minority are in danger. So this idea of mob rule, two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. you're going to have a bad result if you're the sheep, unless you're standing strong and you got some friends to fight back ultimately. And here he is again. This is June 6, 1788. He said, on a candid examination of history, we shall find that turbulence, violence, and abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority have produced factions and commotions, which in republics have more frequently than any other cause produced despotism. So he thought that a mob rule, a pure democracy, rule by faction, basically all the kind of stuff that we're really living under today, even though we're not supposed to be, he said that it's the number one cause of despotism. So maybe we can say Madison was absolutely correct in calling how this would play out if it went this way. So it's essential to create a system where appeals to the people to enforce the Constitution, appeals to the people at large, aren't needed all the time. And if that's the case, they're just going to divide into factions and you're going to end up destroying liberty anyway. So for us today, we've got kind of the worst of both worlds. We've got a situation where enforcement of the Constitution is not happening through the forms of the Constitution. It's not even close to it. The largest government in history is nowhere close to an enforced Constitution. So the people need to step up all the time. But at the same time, the people are terrible on liberty. They are formed into factions. They think in faction first or party first or individual first, not individual liberty, but an individual leader first. And they just are not in favor of liberty. And so any appeal to the people at large could make things worse. It's a very, very difficult situation.
Everybody wants their hand out. You know, Zelensky was traveling around to try. I think he saw the handwriting on the wall. He had to work for his money. Before everybody was inviting him over. We want to be part of the hero who have saved Ukraine and welcome him in and make him an honorary congressman. Give him a speech on the floor. But now he's hustling around with his hat out there trying to get more money. And it looks like he's going to get some because the dissension with the speakership has a lot to do with funding. Ukraine, but there's more funding than that, and which is a healthy debate. Just think how much did we spend over there already? Over $100 billion. And they hardly said boo. So that is coming up. But they have to get together, and they have to get together to instruct the new Speaker of the House, and he has to agree to this. Of course, they have a little ways to go there. Mainly, what if they do have an agreement? They don't have any money. So they'll have to work a deal with the Fed in order to take care of things. But they needed an extra $105 billion. Israel wants money. I'm surprised there's resistance to that. That's the most resistance I've seen. I'm sure they'll get their money. But Taiwan, just in case peace breaks out, in Ukraine and in the Middle East, that's not likely to happen, but they're prepared. We will have to make sure that we're involved in Taiwan in case there's a little skirmish there. And also, some people would argue, well, there's somebody for domestic purposes too for the immigration. But I see that as international and a foreign policy mischief on why this is going on, because we're not defending our borders. And here we have millions of people coming in here and the money for them. So it looks like there's going to be a lot of people happy. The big thing is, will they get credit? So I know you check up on how the people are going. You like polls. Maybe the polls will tell us whether the people have been willing to go along with all this spending.
Yeah, I think this looks more and more, I'm not the first person who said this, looks more and more like Biden's campaign strategy. I'm going to show that I'm a world leader, I'm a wartime president. You even talked about that. I'm a wartime president, and that's going to take the place of him having to actually campaign. He's not going to have to debate former President Trump. He's not going to have to appear because he's too busy manning all these wars that he wants. And as you say, he's looking for a three-front war. That's going to cost some money. So he turns to Congress. If we can put that first clip up from our friends at antiwar.com, he says, you know what, I need $105 billion because I need to arm Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. Under his presidency, we now have a three-front war. That's another $61 billion, I think, to Ukraine. And as you say, Dr. Paul, we've already spent about $130 billion there to zero effect because Ukraine has done nothing. The counteroffensive was a complete failure. And now they're in the part of the muddy season where they really can't do anything. So $60 billion for that one. And then we've got to give 14.3 billion to Israel because they have used up all their weapons bombing the Palestinians to death. And then, of course, you say some money for Taiwan. We can't let that go unspoken, so we have to spend over 7.8 billion, sending more weapons to Taiwan, just so the Chinese keep irritated with us and keep feeling like we're about to go to war.
You know, there's a lot of mixed opinion about the 8 that got the speaker thrown out.
Oh, yeah.
But I heard one of the members of that group of 8 talking the other day. You know, he was describing how desperate this country is and is going to get financially, and yet they're looked at because they're sticking to their guns, and they wanted to cut. But anyway, that is dramatic. That is an example. This is dramatic. It shows where we are on this. There's for the whole Congress now. They're still spending the money. They're going to get this money. I mean, what are they going to put it up and vote down, and everybody's going to forget about it? There's no way that's going to happen. There'll be a few lobbyists knock on the doors, and they will get this money. But if you happen to stand firm on the Constitution, the promises the party makes, and also what the people in Congress campaign on. But when it comes to spending, they just don't have the courage to quit. But the problem is that they don't realize it has already ceased to exist, because the theft of the money from the people has become difficult because they can't keep taxing people. So they don't even think about it hardly. They just run up the debt. And print the money. So nobody's really worried about this not happening, except the polls may be showing some signs that they're getting tired of it.
You were on one of the shows over the weekend, and if you look at this rationale, I have to say it, I know it's not nice, but it really does show a twisted mind. Put on this next clip. Here is Mitch McConnell. He says, "No Americans are getting killed in Ukraine. We are rebuilding our industrial base. The Ukrainians are destroying the army of one of our biggest rivals. I have a hard time finding anything wrong with that. I think it's wonderful that they're defending themselves, and also the notion that the Europeans are not doing enough. They've done almost $90 billion. They're housing a bunch of refugees who escaped. I think that our NATO allies in Europe have done quite a lot." So he actually thinks it's wonderful. He thinks several 100,000 dead Ukrainians is wonderful because we're building up our industrial base.
You know, it has been argued, and we tend to agree a lot about this, as did the founders, that be leery about democracy. Sometimes it doesn't produce the best in leadership.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was thinking about, reading all this stuff. And these are the kind of leaders we get. Then I got to thinking, well, what about the president? He was an example of what democracy can bring to us. And well, maybe we have a good vice president. Well, no, that doesn't answer the question. That democracy stuff isn't really working all that well. But it is a sacred cow, and they're able to use that as the cow, but they never change anything. And all it is special benefits. Now, some elections could be more legitimate if they were honest elections, and the people or the government didn't have, so many goodies to pass out.
Yeah.
That's why there's an investment. The people invest in this in crooked government because there's a lot to be gained, a financial gain.
Now, what proof does Plato offer of innate ideas? Well, in general, there is only one argument in favor of innate ideas, and then it's simply a matter of all of the various forms of it. The general argument for innate ideas raised by Platonists from Greece to the present is, we have a certain type of knowledge that we could not have acquired from sensory observation, but we have it. Therefore, it must have been acquired from somewhere else. We must have got it from some means apart from the senses. We must have been born with it. It must be innate. And then the various sub-arguments under this are simply specifications of the types of knowledge which various philosophers feel could not have been acquired from experience. For instance, Plato himself mentions the knowledge of perfection. Remember argument 2 last week. Or he mentions the argument from the order of knowledge, from man's ability to define and classify, which in his opinion, remember, presupposes that we knew universals prior to this life, that we couldn't have acquired them from sensory particulars. And he gives us several other equivalent arguments. One famous, although very weak one, is given in a dialogue called the Meno, M-E-N-O, in which Socrates says to a man who owns a slave, "Bring your slave boy in, and this boy is completely uneducated, and I will show you that he possesses knowledge of complex geometric theorems that no one has ever taught him. I will simply elicit them from him by judicious questioning. And you watch and see. I am not going to tell him anything. I'm simply going to question him." And sure enough, Socrates, by a series of questions, without nothing in the declarative form, everything interrogative, the boy at the end comes out with a complex geometric theorem. And Socrates draws the moral. You see, he had it in him all the time. He just needed to be reminded of it. Needless to say, critics for centuries have said Socrates was feeding him information right and left and doing it in the form of questions. It's not as crude as the following, but what it amounts to is, don't you see that the angle sum of the triangle is 180 degrees? And the slave boy says, yes, you see. So that is not very convincing, but famous, nevertheless. Does Plato offer any proof of the immortality of the soul, which is an essential ingredient of this theory? Well, in the dialogue, the Phaedo, P-H-A-E-D-O, he gives 4 famous proofs for the immortality of the soul. I mentioned one of them last week. That was implied in the second and third arguments that I gave you, that the soul must have existed prior to the body. And that, in essence, is a proof of the immortality of the soul, if it were valid, because if it could exist prior, it could just as well exist after the body, because the essential point in an immortality argument is to prove the independence of the soul from the body, and Plato would have done that. He gives 3 others in the Phaedo. They are very poor arguments, and I will not take your time discussing them. If you're interested, I'll be happy to tell you in the question period. In any case, he is convinced to his satisfaction that he has established the existence of innate ideas, and this becomes a challenge to Aristotle to explain, if he can, how is all knowledge possible, assuming man is born without innate ideas, and Aristotle accepts that challenge and proceeds to define for every category of knowledge which Plato said we couldn't get from experience, how you get it from experience, and we'll see when we get to Aristotle next week. Now let us continue with Plato's epistemology. Let me give you some detail on the steps you have to go through to recollect and reawaken all of your knowledge. You must, says Plato, pass through 4 stages on the road from ignorance to complete mastery of the entire universe. Now I must amend that. There is no real ignorance, but ignorance in quotes, the ignorance of a baby who doesn't remember anything. He illustrates this by a famous divided line which has 4 segments, then you travel up the line, and this is called Plato's theory of the divided line, but the line is not too important for us. What's important are the 4 stages. The first stage he calls the stage of imagining. This is the stage in which you are wholly ignorant, confused, and unenlightened. As far as cognition is concerned, you take all superficial appearances at face value. You are like, in effect, a baby, or you are a baby. This is the stage that babies, according to Plato, begin at. You do not distinguish in this stage between dreams and physical things. If you dream that somebody hit you, you wake up mad at them, because you take the dream and the physical thing as interchangeable. You look in a mirror and you see an image or reflection or shadow of yourself, and you think it's another person. You can't even tell the distinction between images and physical things. In other words, you are simply being bombarded with an unidentified stream of sensations. Morally, the moral counterpart of this first level of imagining, you accept anything that you want, any desire, utterly unthinkingly. So this would represent, in effect, the moral mentality of an animal, which simply desires and goes out and gets what it wants without any questions of right or wrong, or of a sophist, who does the same thing as a matter of philosophic principle. This is the lowest mentality there is.
President Joe Biden announced last week that the United States would be funding and possibly fighting 3 wars in 3 different parts of the world at the same time. It's an ambitious foreign policy for a president who doesn't even seem to be able to express a coherent thought without the help of a teleprompter. Nearly every word of Biden's speech was untrue, including the preposterous suggestion that American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. U.S. interventionism in Ukraine for over 10 years and in the Middle East for decades has brought those 2 regions to the brink of an explosion unlike anything seen before. And if that is not enough, Biden's neocons are also determined to take us to war with China over Taiwan. The world is literally falling apart in front of us as Biden claims we are the only thing holding it together. After a brutal attack on Israel by Hamas earlier this month, Israel declared war not just on the terrorists who attacked its territory, but on the entire population of Gaza itself. Israel's policy of collective punishment, razing Gaza to the ground, has inflamed Muslims from the Middle East to Asia to Western capitals. The anger rages more fiercely than we have seen in decades, perhaps since the founding of Israel in 1948. Yet instead of trying to help facilitate a ceasefire and a peaceful solution, Biden has poured gasoline onto the fire, sending 2 U.S. carrier groups and at least 15,000 troops while threatening war on Lebanon, Iran, and Syria if they intervene in Israel's war on the Palestinians. What might Russia do if the U.S. attacks Russian forces in Syria or Russia's allies in Tehran? Biden also repeated the line that Israel has the right to defend itself. While that may be true, it is not Israel defending itself, it's the U.S. government intervening to defend Israel. And as the entire Muslim world rages against Israel over the destruction of Gaza, how do we think they will feel about us as the financiers and the facilitators of that destruction? By dragging the United States into this war, President Biden has planted the seeds of innumerable 9/11 style blowback attacks on the U.S. Yet he has the audacity to claim that all of this is keeping us safe. Recent polls show that most Americans disagree with Biden. A CBS YouGov poll taken last week shows that the majority of Americans oppose sending weapons to Israel. His Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, assured us that we can afford to finance 2 wars because the U.S. economy is doing exceptionally well. Maybe the American people know something Yellen and the elites do not. As Biden demands another $105 billion to fund the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan, his speech seems to have a touch of campaign rhetoric in it. I'm told I was the first American president to enter a war zone not controlled by the United States military since President Lincoln. He said this in a speech. The statement is blatantly false, but he must believe it gives him an air of bravado. They say that it is advantageous to be seen as a wartime president when elections roll around. But Joe Biden may have miscalculated the level of support he will get from being a World War III time president. Thanks for listening.
The CIA backs Ukraine's attacks inside Russia. So, first top story in a while that's not related to the Gaza war. And this is based on a report published by the Washington Post on Monday, what I think is a bombshell report that has not gotten much attention. So this report revealed how the CIA has supported covert Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, including the killing of Daria Dugina, who's the daughter of Alexander Dugin, who is a prominent Russian philosopher. So this report said that the killing of Dugina was carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine, that's the SBU, and that it was one of many operations inside Russian territory involving special units that the CIA helped form in the wake of the 2014 coup in Kiev that ousted former President Viktor Yanukovych. And that was when the U.S. cooperation with Ukraine really increased, both when it comes to training their military and this covert stuff, which we've known for a while that the CIA was involved in Ukraine. Following 2014, obviously, they had involvement in the country for a long time, but when things really ramped up, 2014 was that turning point. And I'll just read an excerpt from this report. It says, quote, "The missions have involved elite teams of Ukrainian operatives drawn from directorates that were formed, trained, and equipped in close partnership with the CIA. According to current and former Ukrainian and U.S. officials, since 2015, the CIA has spent tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's Soviet-formed services into potent allies against Moscow," end quote. So tens of millions of dollars were spent on this effort, and the CIA support since 2015 has included advanced surveillance systems, training both inside Ukraine and inside the U.S., the building of new headquarters for Ukraine's military intelligence agency, apparently they funded that, and just, general intelligence sharing that was thought unimaginable pre-2014. And officials insisted to the Post that the CIA was not involved in the targeted killings carried out by Ukrainian intelligence, but they said the focus was on bolstering those services' abilities to gather intelligence on a dangerous adversary. The report said that the SBU and the GUR have been involved in dozens of assassinations against Russian officials in Russian-controlled Ukraine, alleged Ukrainian collaborators, and Russian officials and civilians deep inside Russia, like Dugina. And she was killed in a car bombing outside of Moscow in August 2022. This report said that her father was the real target, was the intended target. They thought they were going to leave an event that they were at together in the same car, so they thought they were going to take both of them out, but they just took out the daughter. So despite the fact that they are civilians, Dugin and his daughter, who's now dead, Ukrainian officials justified Dugina's killing because she was a supporter of Russia's war in Ukraine, telling the Washington Post that she was no innocent victim. One security official called her the daughter of the father of Russian propaganda. The official said that the car bombing and other operations inside Russia are about narrative and showing, so-called enemies of Ukraine that punishment is imminent, even for those who think they are untouchable. So this report said that the CIA has objected to some of the Ukrainian operations, but never withdrew support for these Ukrainian intelligence agencies. So what this report is saying, it's not that the CIA is directly involved in these killings, but that they are supporting the people doing it, and they haven't changed that support even after these assassinations. So a Pentagon official told reporters on Monday that the military is preparing for a significant escalation of attacks on U.S. troops stationed in the Middle East due to President Biden's support for Israel's onslaught in Gaza. So the comments came the same day that U.S. Central Command said its forces downed 2 drones that were fired at a base in Syria. So starting last week, there have been a series of attacks on bases housing U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, and they continued on Monday. So a senior Pentagon official told reporters, quote, they've been under an increase of attacks for really the last 3 days or so at various locations, end quote. So this article is from The Gray Zone, written by Wyatt Reed, and it says that the Associated Press has quietly deleted a reference to official Israeli threats to subject the Gaza Strip to a Dresden-style fire bombing campaign, the latest move in legacy media outlets' ongoing push to downplay the impact of Tel Aviv's siege of over 2 million Palestinians. So this AP article previously said, before they deleted it, quote, 4 U.S. officials familiar with the discussions said American diplomats became increasingly alarmed by comments from their Israeli counterparts regarding their intention to deny water, food, medicine, electricity, fuel into Gaza, as well as the inevitability of civilian casualties. Members of the Israeli security and political establishment told the U.S. diplomats that the eradication of Hamas would require methods used in the defeat of Axis powers in World War II, end quote. She said, quote, there were many, many civilians that got attacked from your attacks on German cities. Dresden was a symbol, but you attacked Hamburg, you attacked other cities, and altogether it was over 600,000 civilian Germans that got killed, end quote. So basically justifying a future slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians, it sounds like, is what she's saying. And so Representatives Thomas Massie, he's a Republican from Kentucky in the House, and James McGovern, a House Democrat from Massachusetts, they are circulating letters in the House urging their colleagues to join them in demanding that President Biden drop the charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And this was reported by Fox News Digital. I just want to read a quote from this letter that Massie and McGovern are going to send to Biden, warning about the danger to press freedom that comes with this pursuit of Julian Assange. It says, quote, it is the duty of journalists to seek out sources, including documentary evidence, in order to report to the public on the activities of government. The United States must not pursue an unnecessary prosecution that risks criminalizing common journalistic practices and thus chilling the work of the free press. We urge you to ensure that this case be brought to a close in as timely a manner as possible, end quote.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
I have heard, though, people say, it's hard to know what to conclude from this, because on the one hand, you hear people, probably the architects of the CBDCs, saying that you conspiracy people, you always think everything is going to be put to some sinister purpose, and really this is just a convenience for everybody. But on the other hand, you can find the odd clip from a World Economic Forum meeting where somebody will accidentally let slip that it will indeed let us track your purchases and keep an eye on you. So what do you think is the likely outcome with them?
But with CBDCs, what worries me is, like, if you look at Bitcoin and the immutable ledger that is the blockchain, even though the transactions are anonymous, every transaction for even just one Satoshi, an nth of a penny, is recorded there and can be analyzed going back forever. Now, with CBDCs, it means that every transaction you ever make can be monitored. It means that a central bank can reach into your wallet if it wants and extract money for fines, unpaid taxes, anything it deems. And sometimes, a large corporation takes money via direct debit against your will, and the nightmare you have getting that money back. But when it's the government and you're dealing with the IRS or the Inland Revenue or whoever it is, it's going to be even worse. And there'll be things like, did you get the vaccine? Okay, so we'll reward you with some money. Or did you not get the vaccine? Have you been saying bad things about us on social media? Well, we're going to fine you. And it just means money will become even more of a political tool. It's a whole new evolution in how money can be exploited for political ends. And so I just wish money was apolitical. The reality is that it isn't, and it's going to get worse.
Well, here's the part that I don't quite follow. Money only becomes money, or like Mises would describe money as the commonly used medium of exchange. So you can be a medium of exchange, there could be people who still use seashells or something, but since it's not the generally accepted medium of exchange, Mises wouldn't classify that as money. Mm-hmm. So if CBDCs are used by 12 nerds, but the general public isn't interested in using them, then they never really take off as money. So isn't there a sense in which this can't work without our consent, or is there some way they can coerce us into using it?
I hadn't thought of that. And there's definitely a way they can coerce us. I mean, you see how we're going cashless.
Yeah,
And
a trend that needs to be fought at every turn. In fact, can we stop there? What's the problem with going cashless? They'll say it's convenience. You can just walk around and make all your purchases on a card. How convenient. Just can you tell people what's wrong with that?
Well, cash empowers its users. Because if let's say I'm with you and I just give you money, that transaction only involves you and me. So it can be it's very useful for private transactions, for small transactions, for quick transactions,
like
for immediate.
A tip. A guy takes my luggage up to the room. I don't want to get out a device and figure out how much I'm going to pay him, but I want to just hand him a bill.
Sure, buskers. Think of buskers and beggars. Now buskers and beggars are carrying credit card readers, or at least they are in London. It's bizarre. But the problem with a cashless society is that anyone who's outside of the system, anyone who is for whatever reason is financially excluded, is effectively excluded from the economy. And one of the biggest economic problems in the world is the problem of the unbanked. I still think there's 2 billion people around the world who are unbanked, and people wonder, for example, why did the mobile phone take off in the third world in the way that the landline never did? And the reason is, telecoms companies would have laid landlines in the Arctic if they thought there was money to be made out of it. But to have a landline, you need credit, you need a bank account. Whereas to get a mobile phone, you don't. You only need cash. And so mobile phones have been able to take off, and smartphones in the third world in a way that the landline never could. And the same applies to money. And so one big problem with going cashless is that it is exclusive. But I will say this, in the marketplace, convenience usually wins. And one of the reasons, like, cashlessness suits governments, but I don't believe they've actually imposed it. I think it's happened because credit card readers and fintech is just so good and so advanced. I think that's the main reason we've gone cashless. And there's a few purists that fight it, and I still try to use cash where I can. But a lot of the time, it's just easier. I don't have to carry money around with me if I don't want to. I can just carry my phone and I can just go blop, and it's done. Just a general observation. In most things, America is ahead of the rest of the world, particularly technologically. But fintech-wise, the States is behind Europe. You still use checks. You use cash much more than we do in Europe. There are some countries in Europe and Scandinavia where they're already cashless. And so for some reason, fintech, we're slightly ahead of you. And so if you want to know what's coming your way, you can just look across the pond. And I just think cashlessness is inevitable. And then the next stage from there is programmable money. That's the danger with CBDCs. It's programmable money, where they can use money to incentivize you to do certain things. That's where it gets really Orwellian.
I interrupted you when you were talking about ways they might coerce us into using it. Or maybe they might even just give us a slight advantage if we use it, which will be enough for a lot of people.
Social credit rating. It's, they use it in China already, so I believe. And, we have a thing called the Ministry of Nudges, and I bet you have something similar in America. A Ministry of Nudges is an unofficial name, but it's where they have behavioral psychologists who work with government ministers in order to effect policy. So, for example, they found if you send someone a photograph of your car while you're committing some kind of traffic violation, it's much more likely way of getting you to pay quickly for the traffic violation than if they just send you a fine. So there's all these little ways that behavioral psychology is used as a tool of government. And for sure, when CBDCs come along and programmable money, the behavioral psychologists are going to have a field day.
I got a new Twitter friend. His name is Arik Horowitz. He's an Israeli Jew, and he's been sending me videos and commentary the past few days here, insisting on a ceasefire. And Arik, I noticed in your video that you sent me this morning, you look like a veteran. You want to start with telling us a little bit about your background and who you are?
I would love to, but I don't think now it's relevant. What's most important now is everyone to understand that with one action, demanding ceasefire, we can stop all the cascade of domino effect that will take place if Israel will invade Gaza like an elephant like a bull in a china shop, like they're planning to. So in order to do that, I made a video showing exactly what's going on the ground now, not on your TV or what you hear or whatever. Right now, as I'm speaking from Beersheba, 30 miles from Gaza, we just had a siren. This is like normal time for us. So there are no Hamas fighters storming the border. No one is afraid here. Of course, there's tension, but it's not like security emergency. So things as they are now can continue for a while. So we need to push for not end the war. This will not happen. But if we buy a little bit more time, things in Israel will cool down because people are hurt. And the last thing they really want is a total regional war, which Gaza is only the prelude, the first act. Once this will begin, Hezbollah, then Iran, Iraq, all the rest, the Houthis from the south. Of course, Israel is with, as explained in the video, Israel is not alone, so all the coalition of Arab states, and we know the result. After all the mess, there will be peace. This is what happened in 73, this is what happened in Oslo. So we can now actually skip the war because there is no need to escalate. We need to deal with Hamas. Okay. It can be dealt later in a more gentle, sophisticated, like we know already how to do it. And
can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, if you want to get into how Hamas was created, and it's actually
just about how to take care of them going forward, other than a full-scale invasion.
We know everyone there. If we want to take them, we can take them like we did with the terrorists of the 72 hostage in the Olympics. We took them 10 years later because we were so good at it, you know. So militarily, it's not they present it as the only option, which of course, obviously, it's not. Hamas is only a small fraction of Gaza, which is a small fraction of the whole Palestinian civilians. They are lumped everyone together. Hamas is Gaza, Gaza is Palestine. So we need to kill all of them. It's nonsense. I mean, it's built on the shock, it's built on the vengeance, but it's not rational thinking. Okay, we take all the Palestinians, and then what? And then what? And then we know how it will end. So I understand from where it's coming from. After all the years that was here, the society was divided. Suddenly everyone is rallying to the flag, united to kill the Arabs. Okay, this is nonsense. So all we need to buy more time. This is why the most important thing is to flood this message. We understand Israel, we know you want, okay, but we need ceasefire, we need to take care of the people in Gaza now. We have people in Israel that are not taken care of because everyone is war. But we got communities that were hurt, not only individuals. So it's a massive challenge. So it's in the benefit of everyone.
Can you tell me what your estimate is of Israeli public opinion right now?
No.
I mean, the land invasion has been delayed. Is that because of public opinion?
I'm sorry?
The land invasion has been delayed. Is that because of public opinion or international opinion?
In spite of.
I see.
Look, there, you know the political landscape a little bit. There are leftists here, pro-Palestinians and stuff like that. They are now talking about leveling Gaza, leaving no one alive there. This is how far we've gone in public opinion. Okay?
So that's the overall consensus.
Yeah, no doubt. And people I talk to, look, it's like you have the Ben Shapiro types here that want war no matter what. They know the price and they are willing to pay it. But there are people that are simply carried away with the wave. They are emotionally hurt. They are pumped all the day. Israel at war. Even though there is no effect of the rockets, the sirens are popping twice, three times a day. It's simply a mind game. You know, they're manufacturing consent in like 2 weeks, what they did in 2 years in Iraq. So everything is condensed, compounded. So, but still, we're not in. We could invade it like 2 days ago. Everything was ready. But there are hostages, not only ours. There are Americans, other nationalities. Invasion will doom them.
So, Arik, what you're telling me is, what you're saying is that despite the fact that Hamas was able to break out and commit this atrocity back a week and a half ago, they're locked in tight now.
Yeah.
And the Israeli Jews are not in danger from them now, other than the hostages.
It's like Waco, man. It's like Waco. Right? What if they didn't breach in? What would happen? We don't know, but what could happen?
Yeah.
But here it's Gaza. It's what, 2 million people. We cannot breach in. It's nonsense.
Don't tread on us.
So this sentence right here,
it assists in the creation and the support of an ideological superstructure. As the author of The Great Reset and Google Archipelago, and someone who understands state education because you were a professor at NYU, give us an example of how the ideological superstructure of the state exists and what people need to understand to see through its propaganda.
Yeah. So, I mean, what the state does is, of course, just about every professor in most universities, let's just take the United States as a limited case, they're all really state agents. They're actually all working for the state, and that's because the state is really what's supporting them. I mean, if it weren't for student aid and loans and the whole 9 yards and government grants and all that, these institutions, first of all, they wouldn't be so numerous. There wouldn't be so many employees of these universities. There wouldn't be these, what Hans calls in another essay, intellectual bodyguards for the state. That's exactly what they are. So what they're doing is, and it's very ironic, Keith, because in many cases, or I should say in almost all cases, these people who are intellectual bodyguards for the state they think of themselves as radicals, as people that are opposing the system. But the fact of the matter is they're actually the foot soldiers of the system. They're perfectly in line with the system, because what they are arguing for is statism, and they're using any number of ideologies to support statism. Marxism is one. Postmodernism is another, feminism another. Basically, the whole DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion regime is premised on the state intervening in social relations to make sure that those social relations are equitable and that they include such and such players who are otherwise deemed excluded by virtue of their diversity. So the state is deemed by them as the instrument to rectify all this. So they inadvertently support, they're duped, they inadvertently support the very structures of exploitation that they think they are opposing.
That is a vitally important point that was pointed out to me some time ago when, let's say that social justice advocates are the kindest people on planet Earth. They are still advocating a system which will attract, like a bat signal, the most evil people to a very powerful state. So if you have a bad person, you would want them in the voluntary sector where they can't take a penny out of your pocket or get a second out of your time unless they do so voluntarily. Right. I'm sure Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller might have been terrible people, but we would want terrible people in the voluntary sector, whereas the social justice advocate is drastically increasing the profitability of bad people to, create injustice by occupying the state they wish to see so powerful in the first place. So even if we make AOC queen of the United Nations and we have a one world Marxist state, we don't know who is going to be attracted to that position after AOC, not to mention the fact that AOC today has more institutional unequal power than 99.9% of her supporters ever will. So it's a complete fool's errand to think that equality is something achievable. But when it comes to the unintended consequences of increasing state power, what do people need to know?
Well, they need to know that what you give to the state by increasing its power, even if it's in distribution of resources between different parties that are under state subjection, what you do is you actually grow the state and you make it more powerful and more capable of exploitation. So, and this is why, like, the welfare state is often paired with the warfare state. They both increase the size of the state. In the case of the welfare state, it ingratiates a certain segment of the population to the state. And then those particular subjects are most prone to go along with the state's other exploitative and deadly activities like war.
When it comes to the labor theory of value, what is it from the Marxist point of view, and what is the Marxist missing?
Well, they think that all value is labor. Labor is the source of all value. So when they think that value comes directly from labor time. So if I worked 8 hours a day, I'm creating 8 hours worth of value. But the capitalist is taking 4 hours of that value and siphoning it off as surplus value that he's extracting from me at the point of production. Okay. And so it's premised on this idea that the source of all value is labor. This is obviously not true. The source of value is in the subjects who value something. It's subjective. And it is not tied to labor strictly at all. In fact, there's value that's created that takes very little labor, and there's some labor that leads to no value whatsoever.
Oh, yeah. Mila Kunis could just have an appearance, which means she physically goes to an area and could get probably $100,000, whereas I have spent a lot more hours working on this podcast and have not been fully compensated. But there's tons of labor, especially any entrepreneur will tell you that there is tons of labor that they've done that hasn't been fully compensated. Yes. The problem with this is that they don't focus. They say that the employer doesn't add value. They just exploit labor, even though the employer comes up with the idea of what product or service to sell,
Right.
where to sell it, who to hire, how to train the employees, how to expand, how to invest resources. They literally say like the nucleus of this operation actually isn't important at all. Like, where would you rather be? I'm going to drop you in like any society at any time. Would you want there to be a bunch of capitalist employers competing for your value, or none of these exploiters?
Mhm.
Well, you can clearly see that when the exploiters are competing amongst each other, you're actually able to reap benefits from that.
When when I was deprogramming myself and coming out of Marxism, I read Mises, and he made it very clear to me that the real people that control the productive means of production, the productive processes, are people that buy things, that people that purchase things. They are actually in control of the means of production, because it's consumers who determine what really resources will be used to what end based on their vote in the marketplace, their purchasing of those goods. So one of the first things that's led me to realize is that, first of all, it's not the capitalist class per se that controls the means of production as such. And second of all, the main virtues of socialism are completely undermined by the fact that there is no such thing as democratic socialism, that the most democratic process is the marketplace, because there you get to vote on what you want. And under socialism, what happens is you get dictation of goods by the bureaucratic or elite class, actually, who determine what it's made, what it will cost, and on and on and on. So that it's actually the most undemocratic process imaginable. It becomes a dictatorship over production. It's a monopoly scheme. Socialism is nothing if not a monopoly scheme.
Or does it reflect a much more concerning trend? And I rather think that it does, which is the contraction in the ability of the US empire to rule itself, or rather rule others, which is, of course, inevitable as US GDP has declined from some 50% of world GDP to some 20% of world GDP today. Obviously, the United States can't hang on to its 500 to 1,300 military bases, depending on how you count them, across the world, when its proportion of global GDP has diminished so much. So are we seeing what is perhaps the beginnings of the death throes of the war racket in its attempt to hold on to that, which it cannot hold on to? Because there is an equivalent, which was towards the end of the Soviet Union. And as its ability to hold on to its territories and regions of influence diminished, its military budget started to skyrocket as well. And if so, I think that's a very unfortunate trajectory for the United States and its people to have their productive industry diverted into wealth-destroying and dangerous military-industrial complex. Or there should be some campaign to absolutely mock this absurd construction. When it first came out, I said, look, the CIA, it was actually the maiden speech of Pompeo, is calling us a non-state intelligence agency. This is absurd to be called this phrase by a state non-intelligence agency. But seriously, that I think is a very also interesting question. Is there any similarity to what media organizations do and what intelligence agencies do? Well, media organizations develop sources, protect them, take their information, analyze it. And the analytical part of intelligence agencies also develop sources, take their information, and analyze it. But the key difference is what happens at the end, or rather what should happen at the end, which is a media organization publishes, an intelligence organization doesn't publish. And on this spectrum between intelligence organization and pure publisher, WikiLeaks is famously obsessively pure in its publishing. That is, what we obtain, provided it fits our editorial criteria of being significant and suppressed, then we publish all of it, sometimes to much criticism. Whereas organizations like the New York Times, these are very much closer to the intelligence agency behavior, because they suppress information prior to elections. They also publish fake information leading to war. In fact, as someone who's involved in the media business and who's been the subject of a lot of media, I can't tell you the degree of contempt and frankly revulsion I feel for most of the media industry. There are some fine exceptions, but these are exceptional people, in part because they are such an exception and have to nonetheless deal in that environment. If you think about the Iraq War, we all know the culpability of the CIA, and the Bush administration, but what is the culpability of journalists in the Iraq War and in other wars? Well, look at the numbers. If you look at the number of political journalists in the United States, but the equally serious problems here in the United Kingdom, Actually, it's something like 5,000 active political journalists. We're not talking about sport or cooking or something. So the failure of these political journalists, national security journalists, their failure to do what they claim is their job resulted in how many deaths? Easily over 1 million, maybe pushing up to 2 million if you include the knock-on effects in Syria and Libya. So what is the death count per journalist? It is several hundred people killed by your average political journalist as a result of their incompetence and their failure to do the job that they promised to do, which is to hold power to account, to not censor information and withhold it from the public if they know about it, and to be ever questioning. And I would say also to fight for the rights to continue that activity. In the United States, that's the First Amendment, internationally, Article 19. So I'm fond of saying that at one level, the CIA is perhaps the most incompetent organization that has ever existed. Let's look at what it professes its competence to be. It professes its competence as protecting the security interests of the American people and, to a degree, its allies. But this is the organization whose actions gave us a theocracy in Iran, who gave us Pinochet in Chile, who gave us the Iraq War and all the terrorism and squalor and death that emerged from that, who gave us Libya and turbocharged ISIS and jihadist groups across the Middle East. This is an agency that can't even keep its secrets from WikiLeaks, a small publisher. I find it absolute madness. Look at our rescue of Edward Snowden from Hong Kong, while I was trapped in this embassy. That's absolutely ridiculous. But I have a cool staff. They're bright people, but we're a small investigative publisher. How can it be that in a well-defined toss-up to get Edward Snowden asylum somewhere or have him be arrested, where it's just us lot and a few friends and lawyers against these titanic organizations, and we're successful? It doesn't make any sense. So the answer is that I'd like the answer to be that all me and my staff and our lawyers, we're all geniuses. But I'm afraid the reality. The reality is that these are just totally incompetent organizations with a Stalinist bureaucratic structure who don't really believe in half the work that they do, who are always looking about how to get to get some money, enter into the contractor sphere, and so on. So I think in some ways we should be quite hopeful about those examples of just how incompetent these organizations are. And while at the kind of physical level, installing mass surveillance and producing bombs and dropping them, they are competent and they have good logistics. At the dynamic political level, they're very incompetent. And I think we have to show people that incompetence, so people are not scared to resist their activities.
Now we move to the second stage, which is what Plato calls the stage of belief, or also the stage of opinion. Now by this time, you've grown some years, you have learned to distinguish some facts in regard to the physical world. You can now tell the difference between fact and fancy, between physical objects on the one hand and dreams or images on the other. And you've even risen to the level where you've made a variety of scattered empirical observations and some crude, approximate, rough generalizations on the order of empirical rules of thumb. Now, of course, at this stage, you do not know why any of these facts or generalizations hold true. And therefore, you have no capacity to be certain that they will continue to hold true. For instance, you've observed that if you follow any given man around long enough, he drops dead. But you have no idea why. All men are mortal. That just happens to be a brute observation. Or if you went in for specializing in triangles, you kept measuring them, and their angle some kept coming out to be 180. But as far as you know, the next one might be 179 or 250, who knows? So you have a certain degree of probability here, but not true knowledge. And that is why Plato calls this the stage of belief. You believe certain things, but you don't yet know them. And of course, there's other reasons why you don't have knowledge yet at this stage. You're using your senses to study physical objects, and of course, they're not real, they're contradictory, they're in flux, they can't be known, and the senses are invalid. So for all those reasons, we only have belief at this particular state. The moral counterpart on this particular level would be the average man, who has absorbed a certain set of rules. You shouldn't kill, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't tell lies, but he couldn't for the life of him say why, or prove that they're universal or in what context they're universal. They're just rough and ready common sense rules of thumb. Now notice, your opinion or your belief, Plato uses the two synonymously, might be right and it might be wrong. But even if it's right, it's still simply an opinion, a belief. It isn't yet knowledge. Stage 3, going up the line, is the stage he calls thinking. That's the point, the stage where science begins, which means, having gone through the stimuli of the preceding stage, we now are able to turn away from the physical world to the sensible world altogether and focus our attention on the forms. individual, separate forms at first in this particular stage. And the crucial thing we find is that every time we grasp any one form, it illuminates and makes intelligible everything that we had observed on the preceding levels. As soon as we grasp a form, that explains why the rules we had earlier simply empirically observed are true. Now, this is true of every level. Every stage explains the preceding stage. And so we can illustrate this by imagining for a moment that for some fantastic reason, which I can't think of, you wanted to go in for a study of the shadows of a horse, a particular physical horse's shadows. And you had never seen the horse. You simply were watching his reflections, let us say, in a pond, and you decided to study them. Well, you could learn something by studying the shadows. They might follow a certain progression in a certain order, and you might be able to tell that this is obviously not a banana that's involved here and so on. But you couldn't learn too much, and whatever you learned would simply be a series of brute observations. The shadows move this way and this way, but why they do, you don't know. Now, what makes it possible for you even to study the shadows? The fact that there is a real physical horse. Now, suppose you turn around and see that real horse after years spent studying the shadows, you'd say, aha, this makes sense of it all. Now I see what all these shadows were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. The higher level illuminates and explains the lower. Well, that is exactly true of the third level in relation to the second. Only on the third level you discover horseness. And when you get to it and you grasp the abstract nature of horses as such, then everything you observed about particular physical horses now falls into place, and you see how it follows from the very nature of horsehood, you see. So if you want an example of the three stages with relation to a horse, for instance, well, a baby would be the example of stage one. He doesn't know anything about them. He can't tell a physical horse from a merry-go-round horse. The second stage would be, let us say, a racing fan, who has discovered that certain horses are good mudders and other aren't. That was mudders, not mothers. And others aren't, and so on, but he couldn't explain why at all, and therefore it's just probability. And the third stage would be the theoretical biologist, or if you wanted the science of horses, the hippologist. And he would deduce from the very nature of horse all the preceding rules. Or if you wanted with regard to mechanical phenomena, the first stage would be the layman who is completely ignorant of mechanical things. The second would be, for instance, a garage mechanic who knows by rule of thumb experience that if you smack this particular thing, the car will start, and if you pour oil in here, it won't, but he doesn't know why. And the third stage would be the theoretical physicist who can tell him the laws from which his particular empirical observations are deducible. On the moral level, the three stages would be the lowest stage, the sophist, for instance. The second stage, the average man, who may have correct but unexplained beliefs. And the third stage, of course, the moral philosopher, who explains the reasons behind those correct beliefs. The general principle is the abstract, the universal, the general always explains the particular, gives you the reason for the particular. Well, at this stage, in the stage of thinking or science, we are almost at the stage of certainty, but not yet. It's not yet true knowledge for the reason that I mentioned at the outset. Namely, we only go to a certain point and then we come against the blank wall of the axioms of the various sciences themselves at this stage. And they are not yet validated. They are simply assumptions, so our whole structure is precarious and is not true knowledge. And thus we reach true knowledge, stage 4, true knowledge, where of course we grasp the pinnacle, the form of the good, and at that point we are able to reason down the whole chain and show that everything we had discovered ascending follows deductively from the form of the good. At this point, we have true understanding of the universe. We've hit the epistemological jackpot. So, there are 4 stages, and to each corresponds its appropriate type of object. The stage of imagining, which has as its counterpart images. The man is lost in a world of images with a baby. The stage of belief, which studies physical objects. The stage of thinking, which studies the lower forms. And the stage of knowledge, which grasps the good. Each stage makes the existence of the preceding one, of the lower one, possible, and the knowledge. It gives you knowledge of why, and thus illuminates the lower stage.
So White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said on Tuesday that Israel will continue to hurt innocent civilians in its onslaught on Gaza. And yes, he actually said this, and these comments were made in response to questions about the death toll in Gaza and if the U.S. thought Israel was taking a disproportionate response in its bombardment. So Kirby said, quote, "This is war, it is combat, it is bloody. ugly, and it's going to be messy, and innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different and wish that there wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen, and that doesn't make it right, doesn't make it dismissible, end quote. He also reiterated that the U.S. is opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza, claiming that it would only benefit Hamas. Both Kirby and Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Tuesday that they were open to the idea of a humanitarian pause to allow more aid into Gaza, but it's not clear exactly what that means. But they're both saying no ceasefire, but maybe a pause. So, it's really something with Kirby. So he was the spokesman for the Pentagon before this, and there was one time when he was talking about Russia's war in Ukraine that he started like tearing up, acting like he was going to cry, talking about civilians that were killed. And there was another instance recently in his role as the National Security Council spokesman where he was talking about the Hamas attack on southern Israel, where he started to tear up again. But here, I mean, I should have put the video in. You see how kind of dismissive he is of this idea that a reporter is asking a question like this. He's just like, look, people are going to get hurt. And Kirby is insisting that the U.S. is going to continue to urge Israel to minimize civilian casualties, but that's not happening. Israel's airstrikes are increasing, but Israel's bombardment has been particularly brutal, as we see that they are leveling entire neighborhoods and the types of places that they're targeting. According to Gaza's health ministry, after 18 days of bombing, at least 5,791 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 2,360 children. So over 2,000 children. So the Pentagon said on Tuesday that U.S. troops stationed in Iraq and Syria have been attacked 13 times within a week as the U.S. is backing Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Pentagon spokesman Patrick Ryder said that between October 17th and the 24th, troops in Iraq came under attack 10 times, while troops in Syria were attacked 3 times, and a mix of drones and rockets were used in these attacks. So the U.S. is expecting the attacks to escalate as Israel is ramping up airstrikes in Gaza and preparing to invade. A U.S. official told CNN that the situation in the region is like red lights flashing everywhere, so they're expecting these attacks to really increase. And the CNN report acknowledged, this is interesting, so you see the U.S. saying, oh, ultimately Iran's responsible. The CNN report acknowledged that the Shia militias in the region are not a monolith and can act on their own. One source said that how willing these groups are to act independently is always a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S., which is interesting because what they're basically saying is that they don't know if everything these groups does is at the direction of Iran or not. But they always blame Iran anyway. So regardless of the situation, the U.S. is making it clear that it will hold Iran responsible for any escalations and is warning that it will respond, signaling that there is a risk the U.S. could target Iran directly. Just from following this stuff for a while, I remember towards the end of the Trump administration, during the transition period, tensions were really high between Israel and Iran and the U.S. and Iran, and rockets were being fired at U.S. bases in Iraq. And Iranian military officials were going over to Iraq and telling these militias, stop targeting the U.S. We don't want a war right now, telling them to cut it out, which is interesting. It does go to show that Iran, it doesn't, just because these Shia militias might be attacking, again, we don't know exactly where these rockets are coming from, but it is likely one of the, the many Shia militias that operate in Iraq that were allies with the U.S. in the war against ISIS, by the way. There's this militia, state-sponsored militia group in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and they were formed to fight ISIS in 2014. And their leader was actually killed by the U.S. in 2020 when the U.S. drone striked Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, the head of the Quds force that the U.S. killed, and he was also there with the Iraqi militia leader. So that's why from 2020, after that, for a few years, we did see a lot of rocket attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And they did calm down for a while, but now they're, it could get much more serious, I think, as this Gaza war continues. So the Kremlin said on Tuesday that Russian intelligence agencies are aware of the support Ukrainian intelligence receives from the U.S. and Britain. So the comments came in response to a report published by the Washington Post on Monday that detailed how the CIA has funded and built up Ukrainian intelligence services that are now conducting attacks inside Russia, including targeted assassinations. That's the big story that I went over yesterday. And again, I don't think it got nearly enough attention. It said that the U.S. funded the SBU and the Ukrainian military intelligence to the tune of tens of millions of dollars since 2015. So the Russians, in their response to this, they mentioned Britain as well. And one thing that report did say is that the U.S., the CIA helped the SBU open a new directorate, and MI6 also, another directorate was opened to work with MI6, the British intel agency. So Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "Let's not forget what we said a long time ago. Our intel agencies have repeatedly pointed to the evidence that we have of Ukrainian intelligence being closely supervised by the intelligence services of the United States and the United Kingdom. Our intelligence agencies have long been quite well informed about this, and we have duly taken it into account," end quote.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
No talk about peace, only about war. This is World War III, as we had said, began on February 24th, 2022. From COVID war to Ukraine war to World War. And this is just escalating. World War III has begun. And now it's moved to the Middle East. Right there. Said this was going to happen. What people have totally forgotten, there were 39 weeks of protests going on in Israel against Netanyahu's Judicial Reform Act. According to Haaretz, the Israeli newspapers, Jerusalem Times, Times of Israel, there was a civil war going on. As I keep saying, when all else fails, they take you to war. And it was failing. It's right there. No talk about peace. And all these little politicians, these pieces of shit that love war, go over there and fight. But here's the good news. The good news is that the Ukraine war is over. That's right. Pick up today's Wall Street Journal. Not a mention. Go to Drudge Report. Nothing there. What do they have here? I had it, printed it out. Let me see if I can find it. Ah, here we go. Yeah, this is Drudge. Hamas rockets target Tel Aviv. Syria joins in. U.S. readies mass evacuation for Middle East. Troops attacked 13 times. What the fuck are the troops doing over there? Well, we have no right being in Syria. We have no right being in these other countries. Oh, we're getting ISIS. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Fuck you. Fuck you with this ISIS shit. I had enough. Dozens wounded. Iran, new wave. Hi, Iran, a new wave? Oh, no, not that kind of wave. Oh, Middle East meltdown wave. And Blinken warns, we will defend. Hey, Blinken, we will defend? You're going to go over there and fight? You're going to go over there and fight? What's this we shit? What is this we shit? This was the headline story on CNBC most of the day. Jamie Dimon rips central banks are being 100% dead wrong on economic forecasts. Quote, prepare for possibilities and probabilities, not calling one course of action since I've never seen anyone call it. Never seen anyone call it? I called it. I called it. I said they're full of shit. Oh yeah, all those, you see them. Here, he goes on to say, I want to point out that central banks 18 months ago were 100% wrong. He's talking about the about inflation. I would be quite cautious about what might happen next year. Next year? How about next week? Again, they said it was transitory, temporary, transitory, and I made fun of it. Let's call it transgendatory. So don't say nobody saw this coming. And the point of this is, as we'd say in the Bronx, they don't know dick about shit. You got a bunch of fucking stupid people running the show. You see the numbers came out of Europe? Oh yeah, everything's way down. Germany, oh, way down. This thing, and now the war's escalated into the Middle East. Oh, but the markets went up today. Yeah. Oh, and oil prices went down. Yeah, but gold is still hanging around this 1970 mark. And you go back to just early in the month, gold was down to 1830 an ounce. Here's the story. If Iran gets involved in this war, you're going to see oil prices go to $130 a barrel. It's going to crash the global economy and the equity markets. That's why gold is going up. Today, Israel calls UN chief to resign, according to agency France Press. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, demanded Secretary General Antonio Guterres step down on Tuesday, accusing him of showing compassion for terrorists and murderers in a speech to the Security Council. Quote, The UN Secretary General, who shows understanding for the campaign of mass murder of children, women, and elderly, is not fit to lead the UN. I call on him to resign immediately. There is no justification or point in talking to those who show compassion for the most terrible atrocities committed against the citizens of Israel and the Jewish people. His statements that, quote, the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum express an understanding for terrorism and murder. It is unfathomable. It is truly sad the head of an organization that arose after the Holocaust holds such horrible views. A tragedy. Here's what Guterres said. He condemned the appalling and inexcusable violence by Hamas, as I do, but noted that Gaza has been, quote, subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. You got that? Illegal occupation against the Geneva Conventions and the clown in the UN against Article 242 in the UN. Gilad, Erdogan, or you're too fucking stupid to read that. You could slaughter anybody that you want.
What are the aircraft carriers and their battle group support vessels going to do? Bombard Gaza from the sea?
Well, no. Theoretically, there would be no direct U.S. military intervention or use of U.S. military force in Gaza. I can't see that. We've never done it before. I don't see it being happening here. What I do see potentially military force being used, and this is something that has happened. We've had a number of Iranian-based militias, other terror groups which have been attacking U.S. interests within the Middle East, in Iraq, within a number of places which relate to the issues of our profile, our deployment locations. So that's what we're faced with right now is that issue is what would our military force be used to regarding U.S. military objectives, not to support the Israelis directly.
If Israel invades on the ground,
yeah,
will Russia get involved, either militarily, diplomatically, or in some other way?
So Russia is playing a very similar role to what it did back in '73. Remember, back then, it was a bifurcation of the West and East, the West being United States primary, the kind of the hegemon, and then you had the Russians, the Soviets, as the other hegemon. And I think that's what we're seeing again now, with the Russians and Chinese and Iranians kind of all on one side. So the Russians are involved. The Russians are the ones who were the partner to the Syrian government. Anytime you do something in Syria, and the Israelis already have, you basically are dealing with not only Syria, you're dealing with Russia, because Russia is the client state that supports them. Iran is the same way. You've got basically Russia right now behind the Iranians in a very large degree because of relationships relating to the Ukraine war with the Iranians. Iranians are producing drones that are being used in the war. So there is a larger, again, kind of, I don't want to say it's a second Cold War. It's not quite that clear, but there is a clear Russian influence and presence within the Middle East. And the Russians, by the way, this is something that people tend to forget. When Joe Biden did his trip, Judge, about almost 10 days ago now, over there, I guess 2 weeks, time flies. At the same time, Biden was actually physically going to meet with leaders, with al-Sisi, with King Hussein of Jordan, and Prince I guess I always get this wrong. Prince Salman from
yeah, this is when they stood him up.
Yeah, so they stood him up because Vladimir Putin was on the phone calling these guys, to include Bibi Netanyahu. So behind the scenes, Putin is trying to be seen as a rational guy who can actually create space for negotiation. So it's not just a relationship with the Iranians. It's not just a relationship with Syria. Putin's reaching out to all these leaders that we otherwise would have a direct relationship with. And I think it's one of the reasons Biden got blown off.
John Kirby and others have said for the past several months that the United States has run out of 155 millimeter shells to send to Ukraine. And that's why we sent cluster bombs. Oh, right. Bingo. They found a warehouse with 155 millimeter shells, dispatch them to Ukraine, turn them around and dispatch them to Israel. Question. Should Ukraine expect more of Israel going to the head of the line? Second question, how much longer can Ukraine put up with its losing battle?
Well, let's go for the latter first. They've lost. This is why the media is so quiet on this, Judge. I mean, if they had won, if they had prevailed as they set out specific strategic objectives like getting back to Crimea and all this other stuff, if they had done that, people would have been singing their praises. No, it's like little mice running away in the night quietly, trying to get out of the headlights. And that's the dilemma of Zelensky. Do they ask for more and draw attention to their failure, or do they just be quiet and hope for the best? I think it's the latter, the strategy, because Joe Biden in his latest appropriation I think he did a 60-40 split, 60% to Ukraine, 40 to the Israelis, which has got a lot of people in Congress upset because most of the people in Congress, except for a few, do support the Israelis adamantly. And so this is not going over well, nor should it. And so I think Zelensky at this point is facing a material defeat because there's just not going to be enough stuff there for him. And yeah, CNN reported back in January of this year that the United States had raided the wartime stockpiles we had pre-positioned in the region to include Israel and I think Egypt. I don't know that for a fact, but I know we have a pretty big stockpile there. And to your point, yeah, they're bringing it all back because the Israelis are going to need that. And I would argue it's one of the reasons they delayed their ground offensive because I think they're waiting for this stuff to show back up. It takes time to move that amount of ammunition.
You mean we have given physical material to Egypt that we now want to take back and transfer to Israel?
So what we do as a military is we have large pre-positioned logistics stockpiles. They're in Egypt, but they're not Egyptian. We will set these things up. These are big old, I mean, you could probably see them from orbit if you actually look close enough. They're big old stockpiles because it takes a lot of time to move things over in a crisis situation. So you basically would deploy with theoretically any conventional force deploys theoretically with about 30 days worth of supply, ammunition and food. Well, to get more of that stuff there would take time. So the time that it would take to do that, you have to have a filler to come in and do that. So that's why you have pre-positioned wartime stocks forward so that you have something else you can rely on past that 30 days. Well, it takes U.S. time to set up the new mechanisms to get things over there. That's what happened. So what the United States did, according to CNN, I don't have direct knowledge of this, but CNN reported it. And I think in this case, they were correct. The United States pulled, I think 90% of the 155 ammunition out of our pre-positioned stocks in the Middle East, which is a huge amount. So that's what they're trying to pull
and
back.
So those stocks will be going from wherever they were held, presumably Egypt, across the border to Israel.
Very possibly. Yeah. And the Egyptians,
but not to Ukraine. That's my point.
No. Well, no, I think they were pulled out of this back in January. I think they had to be moved back to the Middle East from wherever they were. I think they were probably in Poland. So
got it. Tony Schaefer, thank you very much, my dear friend.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
Very differently. All I hear is laying the framework by which you justify a full-on invasion of Iran. That's all I hear. I don't.
All I hear is is think about what's happening in Israel. Think about the people being killed. Think about the people being killed in Palestine and how evil all the perpetrators of this are. Iran.
Right.
Like think about Iran. Like
every single terrible video you've seen over the past 2 weeks.
Also Iran. Right?
It's Iran.
Yes.
And I mean, for those that aren't or don't.
We don't want this to get worse. Please don't bomb. Please don't do the things that we are doing. Iran. Evil, terrible. Iran.
Everything that we're saying that Iran needs to stop. Yeah, sure. We've been doing that forever and ever and ever. But we're the good guys, so it's okay. It's like, look, I just don't take this seriously anymore. And
we're the good guys who do bad things instead of the bad guys that do bad things.
Yes, exactly. But it was, I think it was, oh God, I'm blanking on his name now. It's not General McChrystal. It was the other guy, the 7. Anyways.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
I've played it on my show a couple weeks ago, but the seventh nation that we were going to topple in 5 years was Iran, and it has been 20 years since he said that, and it's like
still working on that propaganda.
Yeah, dude, they're still trying, and it's so disappointing because the Obama administration, probably the only good thing they did was get that denuclearization treaty where Iran would stop and they'd have inspections and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And probably the worst thing that Trump did was get out of that. And he was pretty good on foreign policy aside from that, but that was fucking catastrophic because now it's opened this door back up for all the Lindsey Grahams of the world to make these baseless claims.
Just another excuse. Yeah,
exactly. That they're minutes away from a nuclear bomb. Bibi Netanyahu has been the top liar when it comes to this topic forever. He's gone on Capitol Hill. He's held up that big white sign with the black cartoon bomb, like they're this many minutes away, and it's just been a lie for fucking 40 years. It's been a lie. But my fear is that because so many people have been activated because of Hamas's atrocious attacks against civilians, that you will have a lot of people with willingness to reconsider these claims again. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So, I'm actually a little bit more hopeful than I think a lot of people are. And the reason is because of the level. It's something that I've talked about a number of different times. I'm sure I talked about it on this show, is the splintering of the narrative, the splintering of the political consensus. And the fascinating thing is that both support for Israel and Palestine, support for Ukraine and Russia, and the disparate voices in the conflict over these things are completely global. Like you see protests everywhere. It's not one place. It's not one country with one view.
Yeah,
it's all over the place, and it's wild. And
we're talking massive protests. You know,
yeah.
But before we get too optimistic, I do need to point out many of those people in those crowds are, you know, really like against colonialism, and they're like communists. And
sure,
I mean, it sucks because I find myself in alignment with them on this, you know, to some extent.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like simultaneously, they would absolutely, you know, kick me out of my house and say that I'm a capitalist pig, and you know, I have to go to prison.
Absolutely. So there's that element. I want to make sure I'm framing properly why I think it's a good thing. I'm not saying that it's because there's overwhelming support for one thing or another, or that one side is good or has the right image or the right thing that they're vouching for, so to speak, but just that there's not consensus on doing one thing. I think that is the good thing.
That is a good
yes. And you think about like war with Iraq after September 11th and Bush, because like 98%, like it was so overwhelming. Like the idea of arguing against it was just absurd.
Yep.
Like you would have been laughed out of the room, and there wouldn't even have been a conversation. There is a shocking amount of disconsensus, of pushback against the idea that it's good to be in Ukraine. Like the amount of mocking of the money that we're sending Ukraine, the amount of people who are just like, oh great, now we're Israel and Palestine, and the people who are like, Palestine's a freaking open air prison. They have literally been under martial law. They haven't had the slightest thing even resembling basic freedom since like 1967. Of course they're fucking pissed off. And then the other side who are like, look at the staggering amount, like look at the horrific shit that Hamas has done. I've been like tortured by the seesaw of like the people who've been raped and killed by Hamas in the attack, and then the babies with their heads blown off in Palestine. And I'm just like, just stop, stop it, for Christ's sake. You're both like, everybody is just saying, look at this like group, or these like some subset of perpetrators or government, and this set of perpetrators and corrupt government. Now I'm going to bomb all of your civilians. And
it's so fucked up.
Oh, there's a great quote by the author who I can probably find this really quick. The author of Persepolis. She says, "The world is not divided between East and West. You are American, I am Iranian. We don't know each other, but we talk and we understand each other perfectly. The difference between you and your government is much bigger than the difference between you and me. And the difference between me and my government is much bigger than the difference between me and you. And our governments are very much the same."
We ought to have the right to keep what we want. Nobody has a right to take from us. Your neighbor can't take it from us through coercion, but they should not have the right to go to their politician and have the politician send the IRS agent to your doorstep with a gun and point it to you and take what they think that is theirs. Needs are not rights. Entitlements, people who think they're entitled to something because they demand something and they've been told that the society owes it to them, those aren't rights. So we reject that entire notion that people who need something, yes, we can be sympathetic if we want to, but they cannot use any coercion to come and take it from us. So in this situation, of course, it means we don't even believe in the income tax. I mean, that's no income tax. Most of our history, we did not have an income tax. A lot of people say, oh, well, first reaction from a liberal reporter will be, well, who's going to take care of the government? I said, well, libertarians aren't really worried about the government. We're worried about the people. So therefore, we want you to keep your freedom, and we want to keep the fruits of your labor, and we want you to have the incentive. Because today, there's less incentive than there used to be. A lot less incentive to work and keep all the records and send them off to the government. So there's a more incentive to get in the underground economy. Over a third of the people in this country are involved in the underground economy. Now, that's a mixed bag. I hate to see the breakdown of law and order, but you know what I hate to see is I hate to see Reagan get off the hook. Just think the underground economy is probably bailing out this system. It's really very beneficial to the economy because it's the real economy. And the other thing we have to think about, those who are fully in the underground economy are fully employed too. There's no unemployment in the underground economy. And we'd like to legalize it. We'd like to make sure this is available to everybody. And since we existed most of our history without it, and there are still some states that have neither sales taxes or income taxes, and their unemployment rate is lower than the states that have high income tax and high sales taxes. So there's every reason, for practical reasons as well, to argue that we don't need it. Under this system of government, money would be different. Money would not be fraud. Today, if government has some limited roles, which they would in a libertarian society, it would mean that if one individual defrauded somebody else, this would be a reason for government to intervene. Therefore, if there was a private money system and they said this is a gold certificate and you didn't have the gold, that you were then lying and you were fraudulent, so this would involve the government to come in and settle the dispute. But what have we done under our system of government. What we have done is we now have permitted the politicians to become the legalized counterfeiters. So it's turned upside down. Instead of preventing counterfeiting, they become the counterfeiters. And how do they get elected and stay in office? By promising people whatever they want. And the lobbyists grow in numbers, the PACs are growing, the PACs give money to both sides, which is only one party, and the process continues. The politicians vote for everything, they run up the deficits, they undermine the gold system, and of course that's what happened in 1971, total undermining of the gold system, and therefore they could print and create as much money as possible, and all you have to do is study the economic statistics since 1971, and everything is on an exponential curve. Deficits and spending and interest rates, the whole work is on a very, very dangerous slope, the way I see it. Under a free market, you'd have honest money, which means it wouldn't be counterfeit, it wouldn't be paper, it would have to be a commodity, it would have to be something of real value. If we apply this principle of non-coercion to civil liberties, to social problems, it means if your life is your own, your lifestyle is your own. Nobody tells you what to do. You know, a lot of in the media will immediately want to come up to me and they say, and they've done this to libertarians for a long time, and they'll say, and they'll want to put it on the headline. They're not doing it so much anymore because the debate is changing, and we're winning this debate. And I think in a few years you're going to see some change in the law in spite of the rhetoric of the other two candidates. But they'll immediately want to say, you're the people who want to legalize heroin. And that's the summation of the libertarian philosophy. I stopped them right there. I said, no, slow on my agenda about worrying about legalization of drugs. But what I'm interested in is legalizing freedom of choice. That's what it's like. I personally am not all that interested in drugs, but I'm very interested in freedom of choice. Because the freedom of choice for people to pick their lifestyles and what they take into their bodies also protects my rights to live my life the way I want, even though it may be different from others. Freedom of choice means that we protect your right for consumption. Intellectual consumption in this country is not too bad about that. Even though there's challenges there in the public school system, there's always challenges on the books that are available, and I think there's going to be more censorship as time goes on. But basically nobody challenged the idea that we're allowed to read books. Intellectually, our consumption is permitted. Religious-wise, people have the right to follow cults, be very serious religious people. Atheists. These are things that we have accepted. And yet, when they come to this very, very narrow area of one particular drug, they say, we're going to make the people better. And of course, historically, we only started doing these things in this century when we have lost the confidence in ourselves. Lost the confidence that we can be secure in knowing that free choices are something that we can live with. 1913, we had income tax because we were introducing the idea of big government overseas and here at home. We introduced the idea of the central bank, which is a tenet of the Communist Manifesto. So we had our Federal Reserve System in 1913, drug laws in 1914. What else came about during the Wilson era? The FBI. To check on us, to find out what we're doing. Do you know one of the first tasks of the FBI was to spy on American citizens who disagree with Woodrow Wilson on going to war in Europe? I think they did that in 1960s. And wasn't it just recently that our great American President Ronald Reagan, who wanted to get government off our back, used the FBI to spy on 100 American groups because they disagreed with his policy in Central America? And just recently, of course, it's been revealed, and it's very clear that the CIA has been very much involved in all that activity. And of course, Ronald Reagan hides behind the flag and said, I would never break security. I'm not going to tell you really what went on. I'll tell you what libertarians would do. We don't think there's much use for the FBI. If there's use for intelligence, it can be done differently, and we certainly don't have any use for the Central Intelligence Agency, and we'd abolish it. The whole idea of protecting of civil liberties is something that I think we're coming dangerously close to losing. Because they can develop this hysteria over drugs. The drug issue is not the top issue. The drug laws and the Constitution is the top issue. But in the name of drug regulation, they introduce the ideas of controls on us financially, keeping more records. At the same time, what they do is they want to tell us what to do with our lives. They come in and they throw out the Constitution because there are no restraints now as far as search and seizure laws go. This bill that was just passed applies that if somebody has their house invaded because they're suspected of dealing in drugs, this evidence is admissible in court even though the police did it without a search warrant, as long as the policeman used procedures that he thought were compatible with constitutional restraint. That's pretty bad. And yet that's what we're getting. Not only is that applied to drugs, but it's written so that it applies to anything that the government wants from us.
Now, these four stages were illustrated by Plato in a famous parable, or allegory, which he invented, which is a marvelous story, because it captures not just his epistemology or metaphysics, but the essence of the whole Platonic philosophy. And I don't believe any course is ever given anywhere on Plato in which this story is not told, and so I want to take 5 minutes to tell it to you. It's called the myth or allegory of the cave, and it is presented in the Republic. Now, imagine, for instance, that you are all in a dark, dank, gloomy underground cave. And imagine that you have been prisoners in this cave from the time of your birth. You cannot get up and move around. You are chained at the neck and the ankles. You can only look straight ahead at the wall in front of you. Behind you, and unknown to you, there is a group of people that you've never seen. And they are carrying various objects, and behind them is a fire, which casts the reflection of those objects onto the wall in front of you, so that you see only the moving shadows of those objects on the wall and are completely ignorant of the actual object in the fire behind you. Now you, the prisoners of the cave, would necessarily take the shadow, says Plato, as reality. You've never seen or conceived of anything else. And consequently, you would attach great importance to proficiency in shadow detection. You would, I'm here elaborating slightly to make it more modern, but the idea is Plato's. You would give out your PhDs to the man who best was able to detect the shadows. You would make them the president of the country and heap honors upon the shadow experts, because after all, they're the ones that are the exponents of the ability to deal with reality, as you see it. All right, now, says Plato, let us release one of these prisoners. Now, the first thing is he's very stiff. He's been sitting there for years, chained and so on. And therefore, it's painful. When we take him to the back, he has to shade his eyes at first because it's awfully bright back there with this big fire. However, at a certain point, his eyes become accustomed to it, and he says, so this is what's really going on. I was just looking at shadows. All of us were deluded. He is amazed, and we say to him, you haven't seen anything yet. Now we take him up the long sojourn to the surface of the earth, and he emerges from the underground tunnel, and he sees this fantastic new realm that he never even dreamed of. He is completely overwhelmed by the variety, the beauty, and so on, compared with the dingy, dark cave. This he sees as what's really real, and the cave world is just a meaningless appendage. Of course, he can't see very well at first up here. He has to keep his eyes shaded because it's really blindingly bright. They did not have New York weather. So he has to keep his eyes down. But after a while, and that's quite painful, but after a while he grows accustomed to the light and he begins to wonder, where is it all coming from, all of this light? And he finally looks up in the sky and he sees the sun, the brilliant sun which illumines everything, the ultimate source of energy and life. He's reached the end of his journey. Now he wants nothing but to live up there in the world of beauty and sunlight. But he feels that it's his duty to return to the cave, simply to enlighten his fellow prisoners and free them from their delusions. So he starts back down. But he stumbles because he can't see very well now in the dark. Anyway, he makes his way back to the cave, and he finds the prisoners arguing excitedly about some shadow or other. And he rushes in and he says, forget this nonsense. This is all shadows. I have seen true reality. Now again, I'm embroidering a bit, but this is the idea. And his other prisoners say to him, well, what's it like? And he says, well, I just can't tell you. It's incommunicable. You just couldn't imagine it. You'd have to see it for yourself. Well, the prisoners are skeptical, and if we update the myth, they in effect give him a sanity test. They think he's crazy. And of course, since they define sanity as the ability to deal with reality, and thus with shadows, they measure his ability to deal with shadows, and since his eyes are not accustomed to the dark anymore, he does poorly, and he fails, and they put him to death, which is an obvious allusion to what the masses did to Socrates, you see. In other words, they are hopelessly out of touch with reality. That's the famous myth of the cave. And you see the meaning of it. The four stages, the shadows, the physical objects at the back, correspond to the first two stages, imagining and belief, and the ascent to the surface of the earth corresponds to the ascent to the world of forms, and the sun, of course, is the stand-in for the form of the good. The people caught in the cave, who are doomed to believe that that is reality, are the masses of mankind. The few who can escape from the cave and see the true reality are the philosophers. Needless to say, the Platonic philosophers, not the sophistic ones. What does it illustrate? Well, knowledge requires you to leave this world, to turn your intellect away from the physical, to reorient your whole soul, disposition, and interests, to leave the half-real shadow cave. If you want knowledge, it is not of this world. Another point it illustrates, the crucial and final knowledge required is to reach the form of the good. Until you know that, you cannot organize your knowledge into an understandable vision of reality. And therefore, you have no way of knowing how to live a proper life, because you don't know what is the good, what is it all for, what is the purpose of it. You can't make sense of anything without that knowledge of the good, and therefore your actions are hit and miss, chance, self-defeating, self-destructive. And notice also it is a painful process. It's difficult because, and that was the analogy in the myth of the cave, was the constant physical pain he had in adjusting to the light. It's difficult because to grasp it you have to turn away from everything familiar, from the senses, from the physical, and achieve a vision which takes, as I mentioned, years and years of more and more abstract preparation. The result is that most men never reach it. They never learn about even the world of forms, let alone the form of the good. They spend their lives in the shadows. Now I ask you to exercise your ingenuity, if you think it takes that, and predict what are the political implications of this viewpoint. Just ask yourself if the crucial knowledge needed to live is painful, difficult, incommunicable. If you require a mystical insight that only a very few will ever be able to achieve, then who is going to be qualified to tell men how to live their lives and govern their political affairs? Only those few. This is the epistemological base of Plato's Politics, which we will get to later this evening. And it is the first instance of an invariable law of philosophy. Mysticism leads to dictatorship. As to people who oppose Plato, going back now to the meaning of the myth of the cave, if you were to say to Plato, well, I don't believe in your world of forms. I believe in physical objects that I can see and hear and taste and so on, and that's what I take as real. A true Platonist will say that answer gives away everything. That answer is the proof that you are one of the ignorant masses caught in the cave, and that it is therefore hopeless to try to reason with you. But you don't have to worry, because the sojourner from the cave promises to come back down and give you all the guidance you need. Now that is the essence of Plato's metaphysics and epistemology.
So the House finally elected a speaker on Wednesday, and they elected a guy named Mike Johnson. He's a Republican from Louisiana, and his first order of business was putting a resolution on the floor to express strong support for Israel, and this was the first bill that he put forward in his role as speaker. So this resolution passed in a vote of 412 to 10, and it says that the U.S. stands with Israel in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack, and as Israel is relentlessly bombing Gaza. The resolution reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to providing military aid to Israel and said Congress will work to pass more. So the bill says that the House, quote, stands ready to assist Israel with emergency resupply and other security, diplomatic, and intelligence support, end quote. It also called for the U.S. to continue enforcing sanctions on Iran and condemned the Hamas attack. So 9 Democrats voted against the resolution, including Jamal Bowman, Andre Carson, Cori Bush, Al Green, Summer Lee, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Delia Ramirez, and Rashida Tlaib. And 1 Republican did vote against it, and that was Representative Thomas Massie. So explaining his opposition to the bill, Massie pointed to the sanctions aspect. He's opposed to sanctions as a policy, and also the promises of military support and aid. Massie said, quote, it contains an open-ended promise of military support that is so broad that it could be interpreted to commit U.S. soldiers to the conflict. U.S. troops should not be engaged in this conflict, end quote. So Johnson won the speakership hours before the vote and pledged that his first action would be in support of Israel. He said, and now he said this right after winning the gavel to be Speaker of the House, Johnson said, quote, our nation's greatest ally in the Middle East is under attack. The first bill that I'm going to bring to this floor in just a little while will be in support of our dear friend Israel, end quote. So that's his priority, is Israel. So Israel has agreed to a request from the U.S. to delay its ground invasion of Gaza so the U.S. can send more missile defense systems to the region to prepare for an expected escalation of attacks on U.S. troops. And again, this was reported by the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, and there were similar reports earlier in the week. This one was a little more specific. It says that the U.S. is rushing to deploy nearly a dozen air defense systems to the region that will aim to protect U.S. troops stationed in Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said on Saturday that he ordered the deployment of a terminal high-altitude area defense battery, that's a THAAD missile system, and also multiple Patriot air defense systems to the region. This Wall Street Journal report said that Israel has agreed to hold off its invasion until the additional air defenses are put in place, which could be completed at the end of the week. So later on Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that a ground invasion was coming, but he did not say when. Netanyahu said, quote, we are preparing for a ground invasion. I will not elaborate on when, how, or how many. I will also not elaborate on the various calculations we are making, which the public is mostly unaware of, and that is how things should be, end quote. So very vague. So this is an investigation from the New York Times, and it is titled A Close Look at Some Key Evidence in the Gaza Hospital Blast. And what's interesting about this is that this is the bombing of the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City that happened on October 17th. The bombing actually hit the parking lot outside of the hospital where there was thousands of people sheltering in courtyards and things, because this is in Gaza City where people were told to evacuate. So a lot of people went to the hospital to take shelter. So anyway, you know how it went when this story first broke. It was Israel bombs hospital, 500 dead. And it was believable considering what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Israel came out and denied it. They said it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that actually hit the hospital parking lot, and they put out this video from an Al Jazeera live feed that shows what looks like a rocket is flying through the air, and then it breaks up midair, and then there's a blast on the ground, and then there's another big one at the hospital. So according to this New York Times investigation, and the U.S. has also pointed to this video as evidence, according to this investigation, that rocket was actually more likely fired from Israel, not from Gaza. And they also said that rocket was probably not the cause of the hospital blast because it was about 2 miles away. They looked at all the angles. The video that Israel put out was just one angle, and they looked at different feeds and they lined it up. So they're not saying that Israel did the bombing, but what they're saying is that Israel and the U.S.'s key piece of evidence is not evidence. It just has nothing to do with the blast on the ground. So it's pretty interesting to see that come from the New York Times. And they're still saying that, again, that they're not saying that this proves who was responsible, but they're saying, right now, they don't know. They're saying it's impossible to know who bombed that hospital. So Russia is set to revoke its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That's the CTBT. And this treaty prohibits all nuclear weapons tests and explosions, and the U.S. has never ratified it. So this is putting Russia in the same line as the U.S. when it comes to this treaty. So Russia's upper house of parliament, the Federation Council, approved the bill on Wednesday to revoke the ratification. The lower house, which is the State Duma, they approved the bill last week, and now it heads to Putin's desk for his signature. So Russia ratified this treaty in 2000, and Putin has said that revoking it would mirror U.S. policy. So the U.S. and Russia are still participants in the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and that prohibits all nuclear weapons tests except those performed underground. So also on Wednesday, Russia conducted a simulation of a nuclear strike, but this wasn't any kind of live fire thing. It was just a simulation. And it's unclear at this point if Russia plans to resume live fire nuclear tests. So actually last week, the U.S. conducted an explosion at a nuclear test site in Nevada. And according to Bloomberg, the test used chemicals and radioisotopes to validate new predictive explosion models that can help the Energy Department detect atomic blasts in other countries. So if they use radioisotopes, it sounds like it was a nuclear explosion. And Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Moscow perceived the test as a political message. It came just a few hours after Russia said it was going to revoke its ratification of this treaty. So Ryabkov said, quote, "It is definitely a political message. We remain vigilant. As our president said, if the United States makes a move toward full-scale nuclear tests, we will have to give a reciprocal response in that field too," end quote.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You have an article that's coming out tomorrow. It really goes into this in detail. Biden, war in the Constitution. Excuse me. All power in the federal government comes from the Constitution and from no other source. Congress, however, has managed to extend its reach beyond the confines of the Constitution domestically by spending money in areas that it cannot regulate, and in foreign policy by looking the other way when presidents initiate military violence, you write.
So we'll take Ukraine as an example. Congress gave Joe Biden a blank check for $113 billion. Spend it however you want. It's being spent about 25% in cash, going to the most corrupt regime in the world that we know of, and the rest in military hardware. Some of the military hardware can only be operated by Americans. So a good picture right there. So are there American soldiers on the ground? Yes. Are they pulling the trigger that is sending projectiles to kill Russian boys? Yes. Has this been authorized by Congress? It has not. In the case of Israel, because the House of Representatives is dysfunctional, quite frankly, Gerald, I am happy it's dysfunctional. It can't enact any more laws. It can't regulate any more behavior. It can't right any more wrongs in its own mind, and it can't tax any more events. Let it stay dysfunctional for a long time. But there's been no authorization whatsoever for Israel, and still we have special forces on the ground in Gaza. Colonel McGregor says 2 of them have been killed, and we don't know about it. He knows it from his sources. Israel and the U.S. are keeping it from mainstream media. And what are those 2,000 Marines getting ready to do? Storm the beaches without congressional authorization? Did Congress declare war on Gaza and somehow we missed it?
Presidents don't care about the Constitution, and they make up these laws that give the president the right to do anything that he wants.
Correct. They made up the War Powers Resolution, which allows any president to fight any war against any foe at any time for 90 days without a declaration of war, in defiance of treaties, without congressional approval. Then he has to go to Congress after the 90 days. If he doesn't get it, he's got another 90 days to wind down whatever he started. If he refuses to wind it down, then it takes 2/3 vote of Congress to bring it back. This is patently unconstitutional. Nixon vetoed this because he thought it crimped his style. Nixon thought that just because the president does it, that means it's lawful, and the president could kill anybody he wanted. It's unlawful because it is a delegating from Congress to the president the power to choose a target for war. Madison was very clear. If the president can both choose a target for war and wage the war, he's not a president, he's a prince. We have that power separated. But Congress looks the other way when presidents kill people, particularly if they're unpopular people like the Palestinians.
Well, let's look at all the
Russians.
presidents in our lifetime that have killed people.
You could not name a president from FDR to the present who has not killed people without a declaration of war. FDR, for all of his faults, he did have a declaration of war, but start with Truman and go all the way up to Biden. They have all killed without declarations of war. Absolutely.
Well, how about I don't think JFK did he?
Good point. You're right.
And they killed him for not doing it.
Correct. They killed him for wanting to dismantle the CIA, the president's secret army.
And not go into Vietnam.
Right. Well, we were in Vietnam. I suppose we killed people there under JFK. He thought he was sending advisors in and never imagined it would morph into 500,000 troops, 10% of whom would come home in body bags.
Yep.
52,000 American boys of your generation and mine killed in a useless, meaningless, immoral, illegal, unconstitutional war that was intended to let LBJ have 12 years in the White House.
And about 250,000 to 350,000 seriously wounded.
Yeah.
And mentally, I know guys that were there, they don't want to even talk about it. They're so upset about it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we had the Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner, Barack Obama. Assad has to go. Gaddafi has to go, and lies his way into power by becoming president as a peace candidate. And he launches the Afghan troop surge. And then we had Bill Clinton. Every time he got caught with his pants down, it's bombs away over Baghdad. And then we have Biden, who in his stupid talk the other day or last week talked about the Israeli war. He quotes Madeleine Albright.
The killer, if ever there was one.
Who's quoted, and anybody could Google it up, but Madeleine Albright, Leslie Stahl's 60 Minutes, when Leslie Stahl asks her if the price of 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 that have died because of what Bill Clinton did to Iraq, is it worth the price? And she said, yes, it is. And that's who Biden quotes.
Yeah. And then, of course, there is the worst of all of them, George W. Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan, lying his way into mass murder and war crimes.
Yep. And you write here, Judge, and this is very important. Beyond the imminent attack, the basis for war must be real. The adversary's anti-U.S. military behavior must be grave. The objective of war must be clear and attainable, and the means must be proportionate to the threat. Has Russian military threatened U.S.? No. Have the Palestinian people? No. What grave acts of aggression have either committed or threatened against the U.S.? You write none. Yet we're at war with both of these.
Correct. Now, what I stated there is not my opinion. That's international law to which the U.S. theoretically is bound by the Geneva Conventions, the UN Charter, 3 or 4 other treaties that we've signed. But, just like the Constitution, just like federal laws, presidents do whatever they want. I don't know what the consequences will be. McGregor and Ritter are telling me potentially disastrous and likely World War III. If those
World War III's begun.
If those 2,000 Marines on that ship storm the beaches in Gaza, do you think that Turkey and Lebanon and Iran will sit still? Of course not.
Your daily dose of Liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
All right, so now we've reached the time when the debaters will have an opportunity to question each other. So, Alan, we'll start with you. Do you have a question you'd like to ask Jeremy?
Yes, well, Jeremy is in favor of a one-state solution. In other words, to basically the destruction of the state of Israel. Given what we saw 2 weeks ago, Jeremy, what do you think would happen to more than 7 million Israeli Jews that live in Israel in a one-state solution?
What would happen to them?
Yes, what would happen to them? For example, if Hamas is in control of the entire state, what would happen to them?
I don't foresee Hamas being in control of the state. I don't think that would be possible or politically feasible.
Really? Why not? They control the Gaza Strip. Why not?
Yeah, well, there's a reason they control the Gaza Strip, as I've already explained, which was because Israel and the U.S. opposed their move toward a unity government with a Palestinian Authority, that opposed their move toward moderation, and tried to drive a wedge between Hamas and Fatah. So it's Israel's own policies that have really created this monster in Gaza. And so, I don't foresee if there were, it's hard to look at a hypothetical like, well, what if suddenly we have a single state? Well, what would that look like? I guess the state that you're imagining isn't the same state that I'm imagining. And also you say that I'm advocating the destruction of Israel. Well, not the physical destruction of Israel by any means. Certainly it would mean if there was a return of refugees, if the right of the refugees was respected and they were allowed to return, it would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish state, which I can understand your opposition to that. But I personally find the idea of a state defined by ethnicity or race to be quite abhorrent.
Can I answer to that, Tom?
Yeah, please.
Well, at least you recognize that there is a monster in the Gaza Strip. So congratulations for
Certainly.
that. Now, of course, you're saying that you would prefer this one-state solution to look like a free country. There are no words to define it. It is obvious that if the state of Israel disappears, the Jews are going to get murdered, and that's going to be genocide. This is not hypothetical. We saw it 2 weeks ago. What do you think would happen? They would swim in chocolate rivers and drink tea with cookies with Hamas and the like? Of course not. Come on, give me a break. Now, apart from that, you say that it would be a sort of a place where equality before the law. I talked about the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Arabs. They have exactly the same rights as the Jews. Even more, they don't have to be forced to serve in the IDF. Jews are. So, it exists in Israel right now. Now, if you're going to say, well, Israel doesn't withdraw basically its security operations, for example, in Judea and Samaria. Well, in Gaza, they have full control, basically Hamas. But in Judea and Samaria, there are 3 areas, as you know. And what do you want Israel to do? To, apart from Gaza, to have another Hamas theocratic dictatorship in Judea and Samaria right next to every other Jewish town in Israel? Basically, what you are advocating is for the Jews to commit suicide. So
After just let me interject here. After Jeremy's response to this, then I'll give Jeremy an opportunity to ask you a question. And then if you both would like to repeat this process, I'll give you, Alan, another chance for another question. So Jeremy, do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. So again, just talking about this hypothetical one state, he's saying what would happen is if that could exist, is that the Palestinians would just murder all the Jews. Well, I think that overlooks that in order for that to ever possibly happen, hypothetically speaking, that would resolve the legitimate grievances of the Palestinians. And so again, he's just looking at it from the point of view of his analysis that the root cause of the conflict is just inherent Arab hatred of Jews. I've already addressed that. That's not the case. They have legitimate grievances. Alan's just refusing to acknowledge them. So that's my response to that.
Alan, would you like to? You can take 3 to 5 minutes if you like to sum up the argument, or one final response to Jeremy, whatever you like to do at the time.
It's important to get back to the main issue here, which is basically that Israel is justified in doing whatever it takes to completely destroy Hamas. Now, as it is clear from its own charter, Hamas' goal is genocide. Its political system is a medieval theocracy that intends to kill every freedom and bring death and destruction on anyone who does not support its totalitarian agenda. It is funded by Iran, which seeks to impose a global dictatorship under Islamic law. Israel is the exact opposite of these maniacs. It is an open society that loves life and defends human dignity. In a fight between civilization and barbarism, any decent human being, especially libertarians and classical liberals, whose entire philosophy is based on life and liberty, should side with Israel. And this implies supporting Israel in its duty to destroy Hamas. I would like to say that there was this old von Mises lecture. I don't remember if it's an essay or a lecture itself. It's called basically middle of the road policies lead to socialism. Something like that. Well, here in this context, middle of the road positions lead to Hamas, because Hamas is looking for genocide. That's what they're looking for. And just one more thing. Jeremy mentioned before that the war in 1948 was because of Israel, and that's why the resolution 181 never came to be. Well, it never came to be, Jeremy, because you had several Arab armies that went to make war, to build war, wage war against Israel, and to kill the Jews. Basically, that was their stated goal, not to create any Arab state or any Palestinian Arab state. So basically, That's all I can say about that. And I hope people have more clear idea of why Israel is entitled to do whatever it takes to destroy Hamas. Thank you, John.
All right, Jeremy, final word from you.
Sure. Just to clarify one point there, the reason Resolution 181, General Assembly Resolution 181 was not ever implemented is not because the Arab states launched an attack on the Jewish community in Palestine. It was because the General Assembly had no authority to implement or petition Palestine. It forwarded that recommendation under the Security Council, where it died because the Security Council recognized that it could not, it had no authority to partition Palestine against the will of most of its inhabitants. So just to clarify that. Coming to the resolution, just to summarize my point, I think it's important that we recognize Palestinians' legitimate grievances historically and right up to the present. And only by looking at their legitimate grievances and acknowledging them can we possibly get our analysis correct. And I think it's unfortunate that so many people criticize and condemn, rightfully so, the crimes of one side or the other. They unfortunately tend to then defend the crimes of the side that they favor. And what I'm saying is that we should be critical and condemn the crimes committed by both sides. But the case is that we are dealing with a situation where you have an occupier and an occupied people. And the crimes committed by Israel against Palestinians have occurred on incomparably greater scale, starting with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by which the Jewish state of Israel came into existence.
Thank you so much for being here. And you may be aware that 22 years ago tomorrow, that's October 26th, 2001, what should be absolutely hated and despised Patriot Act was signed into. And as John Whitehead put in a recent article, he said, "We're still grappling with the blowback that arises from allowing one's freedoms to be eviscerated in exchange for the phantom promise of security." We are living 22 years of Patriot Act blowback, and I want to get right to this. Here from a great article by Judge Andrew Napolitano, and he points out that there's a long tradition of this kind of thing throughout history, from George III and his Stamp Act of 1765, which resulted in British agents searching colonial homes without individualized suspicion, to George W. Bush and his Patriot Act of 2001, which enabled one federal agent to authorize another to search without any warrants in defiance of the Constitution. Tyrants have consistently claimed safety as the excuse and purported benefit of trampling liberty. And the people living in fear, of course, and this is my side, this is not Judge Knapp, the people living in fear will gladly look to the government, well, that often is the one that's oppressing them, and I'm understating this by quite a bit, to somehow protect them. The people with all the power are not the ones that you really should be going to. Anyways, Judge Knapp continues. In both 1765 and 2001, the liberty sacrificed was the right to privacy, the right to be left alone. Now, there was resistance in a much different way in 1765 than there was in 2001 and the years to follow. But we'll get into this a little bit more in just a moment. Now, back to John Whitehead and his great article, 22 Years of Blowback from the USA Patriot Act, which I taxed the title for this episode from this article. And Whitehead puts it this way: rushed through Congress a mere 45 days after the 9/11 attacks. And if you think about this, and I don't want to get too tinfoil hatty here, but this is a massive piece of legislation that references, when you read through it, a lot of it is just referencing other stuff that's on the books. To knock that out in 45 days, to knock it out and get it passed and signed into law in 45 days, that means someone had to have had some ideas of how this needed to be done, this to legalize more violations of the Constitution. I mean, they're illegal because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, but to put in statute that more violations of the Constitution were legal, it's like they had it ready to roll just in case something crazy went down. What a surprise. But anyways, rushed through in a mere 45 days after the 9/11 attacks, the USA Patriot Act drove a stake through the heart of the Bill of Rights, undermined civil liberties, expanded the government's powers, and opened the door to far-reaching surveillance by the government on American citizens. And of course, it didn't end at the Patriot Act. A lot of people think that the Patriot Act is just Section 215, the Call Detail Records Program, which I believe expired in 2020. But they do the same thing under other authorities, and a majority of the Patriot Act is actually permanent. And some of the things that were set to sunset were, well, extended or made permanent. Now, when thinking about the Patriot Act, which obviously should never have existed in the first place, but was passed and supported in a time of extreme fear, it's hard not to think of Benjamin Franklin's great quote from 1755. "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And also John Adams, back when he was one of the good guys, pointed out that fear is the foundation of most governments. Of course, I would just remove the word most on that one, but the sentiment is absolutely true, and we are living in that reality today. Just hear from John Whitehead. Again, another article, Who Will Protect Us from an Unpatriotic Patriot Act? And he points out that the Patriot Act also redefined terrorism. And I think this is a huge part of it that a lot of people miss because we focus so much of our time and energy just on the surveillance authorities, but they also redefined terrorism so broadly that many non-terrorist political activities, such as protest marches, demonstrations, and civil disobedience. Remember, James Madison told us that the people should use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union in Federalist 46, arguing that the structure of the Constitution made that an essential tool to keep the federal government within the bounds of the Constitution, or even just stop bad policy that is within the bounds of the Constitution. So, I mean, they want to call it civil disobedience, but it's the government that's disobeying, and it's the people that are refusing to go along with it in that scenario. But of course, the Patriot Act gives us such a broad view of terrorism that we've heard in recent years that all kinds of weird stuff. Someone might get brought up on terrorism charges. They aren't always, but I think we're always being probed for more and more and more. Demonstrations and civil disobedience are now considered potential terrorist acts, John writes, thereby rendering anyone desiring to engage in protected First Amendment expressive activities as suspects of the surveillance state. He goes on. Federal agents and police officers, also on the local level, are now authorized to conduct covert black bag sneak and peek searches, which I mentioned from Epic earlier, of homes and offices while you are away, and confiscate your personal property without first notifying you of their intent or their presence. They don't care about the Constitution, Bill of Rights, nothing to these people, as long as the people go along with it, of course. He said, early on, U.S. officials solved the problem of how to implement their authoritarian policies without incurring a citizen uprising. Fear. The powers that be want us to feel threatened by forces beyond our control. Terrorists, shooters, bombers. Fear is the foundation of most governments. Fear is the foundation of government power. Now, John Adams went on to say that was in 1775, back when he was one of the good guys, before the Alien and Sedition Acts by a couple of decades. He went on to say, you know, the American people are strong. They're never going to fall for this garbage. Well, maybe at the time they weren't going to, but by 1798, they certainly did with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he was the guy signing it. So this is a lesson for all of us. Don't trust people with power, even the people that might sound awesome about the nature of power, because once they're there, they can do a lot of bad stuff. Anyways, back to John Whitehead. They want us to be afraid and dependent on government and its militarized armies for our safety and well-being. Most of all, they want us distrustful of each other, divided by our prejudices, and at each other's throats. Wait, once you trade your freedom for security, the terrorists win. Once you trade your freedom for security, the terrorists win. And that's, I think, kind of what Benjamin Franklin's quote really gets to the heart of. That if you give up liberty for so-called security, you really deserve neither, because you're making a terrible, terrible choice. And I know there's some interesting context about that. But Thomas Paine, I think, sums it up best. The strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it.
Where the contest is between Biden and Trump, you know, it's a heavy burden to try to say, yeah, this guy is really the good guy and he's right on everything.
Yeah, it's impossible.
So we'd rather have Thomas Massey in that argument.
That would be a good idea. Well, let's look at a couple more reactions. Put this next one on. Now, I don't know this person who tweeted. It's just interesting. I think it's a journalist, a conservative journalist. Breaking: Mike Johnson has officially been elected speaker. Mike has pledged to release the January 6th footage promptly, kill the omnibus spending bills, and is hated by leftist Rep. Adam Schiff. And then he goes on by saying, thank you, Representative Matt Gaetz, for making this happen. And I think that's also interesting because I think Matt Gaetz's capital has risen significantly. Now, he was really kind of the donkey for a while because you got rid of McCarthy without a plan, and I think Massey made that point, and it was a legitimate point. But I think now he has recovered, bringing in Johnson, who Massey has supported as well.
But you know, we look at this and we should, especially under the circumstances of getting a new speaker, and we don't want it too hard. But I can't help but thinking, well, what was the first thing? They had a bill already, then they passed it overwhelmingly, and they didn't even read it. They didn't have it printed out. So that problem is still existing.
Well, let's go to what you were talking about, Dr. Paul, because there was some business on the House floor yesterday. Let's go to this next one. This is from Johnson's initial speech as the Speaker of the House. He says, we've got to bring relief to the American people by reining in federal spending and bringing down inflation, which sounds good until you look at the next quote. If you want to put the next one up, then he says, so he gives relief to the American people, then he says, the first bill I'm going to bring to the floor will be in support of our dear friend Israel. So the very first thing he does, before anything else, to give any relief to Americans for spending and anything else, is to put out a bill on Israel that, as you point out, no one had a chance to read, really. We weren't able to see it until this morning.
Yeah, and, you know, in the bill that Biden has proposed, there's $14 billion already. And you know, with this resolution and the consensus, there will be more money. I mean, even without any of this activity. But the law of the land is laid out there, so the money will be spent. And that's why my pessimism creeps in, you know. And I think justifiably, are they really going to cut anything? You know, and that is the big problem. And they never want to accept the fact that, well, we should take this opportunity. You know, there's too many people that want money, and we're supplying money to both sides. We've sent money to the Palestinians and to Israel. Well, if we're running out of money, oh, we have to cut this, or no, we have to cut this because these are the bad people and these are the good people. And what's the matter with not going along with the Constitution? Where is the authority to have foreign aid?
Yeah, at all.
Cut them both. But that's not quite there. But that's where it has to happen, though, eventually, because we are bankrupt, and the bankruptcy will probably come where they won't quit printing, but the elimination of the debt will occur through the inflation.
Yeah. Well, it's like you said when we were up in D.C. To the audience. We haven't had a speaker for a couple weeks, and nobody's even noticed. So it's only the Washington class that says that. But so on this Israel bill, I bet Thomas Massey wishes that he had you back and Walter and Jimmy Duncan back up there, Virgil Good and a few others to be around him, because he was the only no vote on this bill on the Republican side, which can be very dangerous. There's a lot of strong support for Israel in Congress, not so much among the American people as we talked about earlier this week, but nevertheless it really puts a target on his back. But wisely, he came out with a good statement on this. If you can put on this next clip, this is a tweet that Massey put out when he voted no. And I'm going to read some of it, a good deal of it, because it's good. He starts out by saying, "I condemn the barbaric attack on Israel, and I affirm Israel's right to defend itself. However, I will not be voting for the resolution because," and this is true, this is the last three resolve clauses, by the way, and he talks about, 1, it calls for sanctions on a sovereign country. Sanctions are a prelude to war and hurt the citizens of the country more than the government of the country that's being sanctioned. Ultimately, sanctions create laws that will be used to prosecute American citizens who engage in trade, not citizens of the sanctioned entity. In short, sanctions do not achieve their stated purpose, but breed resentment of our country abroad." Great point. Number 2, he says, "It asserts the necessity of foreign aid commitments, which I have voted against. Our country is going bankrupt, and we can't afford to borrow money to send overseas. Yet this resolution states that we should." And go to the next one, if you'll just bear with me, Dr. Paul, because it's worth reading what he says. Number 3, it contains an open-ended promise of military support that is so broad that it could be interpreted to commit U.S. soldiers to the conflict. U.S. troops should not be engaged in this conflict. And 4, it tends to broaden the conflict to other countries when it would be better to keep the war contained geographically. So I think we're about ready to close out. We need to get some sleep. We were flying around and our wings are tired. And so I want to thank all of our viewers. Thank you for being patient while we slipped in a couple of best of programs over the week while we weren't here in town. We're glad that you're back with us and watching the show. Please hit like and please comment. And please send the show around to your friends. Help us get more subscribers and more viewers. We appreciate you very much. Over to you, Dr. Paul.
Very good. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. And we're glad to be back here on our usual seats here doing our little program. And as I mentioned earlier, I got more interested in going there when Daniel explained to me, this is the Committee for the Republic. They want to, preserve the Republic. And that is a big issue, because the holy word that you use by politicians incessantly is, we're going to go to war to the world. We have an empire. We're going to spend whatever it is to spread democracy. And if you really look at true democracy, it's one thing that the founders despised, and they tried to write the Constitution to try to, prevent the dictatorship of the majority. It befuddles me why people who come from the left are so adamant on pure democracy and will never look to the Republic. And I said to them, well, under a democracy, all you have to do is get 51%. You can do anything you want to the minority. And right now, the people who want special benefits, they're in the majority. And those of us who are in the minority and we believe in liberty and the Constitution, it's a rough job. So we have to convert people once again to pay attention to our traditions and what it would be like if we did have a true republic and that we were voting to protect liberty. Then I believe that we would be on the road to peace and prosperity, and that is our goal.
We want now to turn to his ethics, but before we do it systematically, you can see from the myth of the cave itself the general direction or tendency that Plato's ethics will take. What will be the goal of the moral man? Obviously, to escape from the cave, to reach the higher world of beauty, truth, and sunlight. His attitude to the cave, to this world, in other words, will be disdain, dislike, yearning to get out. Now, how in actual life does a man escape from this world? His body is doomed to remain in this world. It's physical, it's part of the sensible world. Only his soul can go to the world of forms. And this it does when the man dies, at death. And consequently, the ultimate goal of such an ethics is death. In other words, escape from this world, the freeing of the soul from the body, the shadows, and the imperfections. Now, you may think I am reading something into Plato. implicitly criticizing him from the framework of the objectivist ethics. So I quote you a passage from the Phaedo, quote, this is Socrates speaking, representing Plato's view. Quote, ordinary people seem not to realize that those who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death. If this is true and they have actually been looking forward to death all their lives, it would of course be absurd to be troubled when the thing comes for which they have so long been preparing and looking forward. If a man has trained himself throughout his life to live in a state as close as possible to death, would it not be ridiculous for him to be distressed when death comes to him? It is a fact that true philosophers make dying their profession. Unquote. Now you may ask, well, why not commit suicide? And Plato's answer is the same as the Orphics before him and the Christians after him. They create this world, this other world, which they regard as magnificent, but after all, if you exhort your followers to suicide, it is very difficult to have a mass movement. So suicide is prohibited. God giveth, God taketh away is the idea. Nevertheless, what you can do during life is free the soul as much as possible from domination of the body. In other words, live an ascetic life. Here's a brief excerpt from the Phaedo, dialogue between Socrates and another philosopher. Do you think that it is right for a philosopher to concern himself with the so-called pleasures connected with food and drink? Certainly not, Socrates. What about sexual pleasures? No, not at all. And what about the other attentions that we pay to our bodies? Do you think that a philosopher attaches any importance to them? I mean things like providing himself with smart clothes and shoes and other bodily ornaments. Do you think that he values them or despises them, insofar as there is no real necessity for him to go in for that sort of thing? Answer, I think the true philosopher despises them. Then it is your opinion in general that a man of this kind is not concerned with the body, but keeps his attention directed as much as he can away from it and toward the soul? Answer, yes it is. So it is clear in the case of physical pleasures that the philosopher frees his soul from association with the body so far as is possible to a greater extent than other men, unquote, etc. Now you know that Plato has a legion of followers on this point, stretching all the way from the early Christians to the late hippies. In their anti-materialism, right down to their own body and to the clothes they wear, their basic attitude is Platonism. They do not, however, apply it to sex in the way that Plato recommended. And I should say in Plato's behalf, he was much neater. And I should point out that the hippies do it on the same metaphysical epistemological basis Plato, from whom they got it, although they got it directly from the comic strips, but ultimately from Plato. Namely, the idea that there is another reality which transcends this one, and that you grasp it by a mystic vision. However, they represent a new modern version of mysticism in which the key to the mystic vision is not 40 years of higher mathematics, but one dose of LSD. That, however, is simply the transformation of mathematics into chemistry as the supreme key. That does not alter the philosophy involved. Now you see here there is an exact parallel which Plato explicitly draws in his epistemology and his ethics. In epistemology, the bodily senses deceive us. True knowledge comes from pure reason itself, severed from the physical. Well, just as the bodily senses deceive us in epistemology, so the bodily desires corrupt us in ethics. And true virtue is thus being anti-physical. So both knowledge and virtue require leaving the cave. In other words, leaving this world. And you see here the obvious Pythagorean Orphic influence on Plato. I remind you again, Plato is a Greek, and he is not fully consistent. Certain of his dialogues are much more this worldly, insofar as he writes qua Greek. Greek was simply too healthy a civilization to produce anything such as the aberrations which came when Christianity took over. And you will see that when the time comes in this course.
All right, so this story just broke as I finished recording the full show. The U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria. The Pentagon announced this on Thursday night, said that they targeted 2 facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups, and this is a significant escalation that makes a regional war more likely amid Israel's bombardment of Gaza. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a statement that the strikes were in response to the series of rocket and drone attacks that have targeted U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria in recent weeks, which the U.S. is blaming on Iranian-backed militias, referring to the Shia militias that operate in the region. Austin said, quote, "These precision self-defense strikes are a response to a series of ongoing and mostly unsuccessful attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed militia groups that began on October 17th," end quote.
Recently, a U.S. official actually told CNN that how willing these groups are to act independently of Iran is a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S. So that's them basically saying they don't know how often they will just act on their own or if they're acting on behalf of Iran. So the point here is that the U.S. doesn't really know if Iran is directing these attacks or not. So just keep that in mind, because you're going to see the hawks try to drum up war with Iran. So the increase in attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria was due to President Biden's support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And now, again, I've said that this has happened before, where Biden bombed eastern Syria or Iraq, targeting specifically, the Shia militias. And usually it's a flare-up that happens over some rocket attacks on U.S. bases. The U.S. bombs them, usually kills a few dozen. Right now, this is Thursday night. No reports about the casualties. I'm sure that'll become clear on Friday. But what usually happens in these flare-ups, the U.S. bombs them. They might fire some more rockets, but if no U.S. troops get killed, then maybe the U.S. stops the bombing, or the U.S. launches some airstrikes again, and then that's it. Somebody backs down. But I think the situation, what I'm worried about is, I expected that the U.S. was going to do something like this, and what I'm worried about is that they're not going to back down this time because of what's going on with Gaza, because of how much Israel's bombing Syria. I mean, there's just so much going on now that I think a lot of these groups that want the U.S. out of Iraq and out of Syria might really ramp this stuff up this time. A group of Republican senators have introduced a bill that would give Israel $14.3 billion in additional military aid to support its onslaught on Gaza, separating the funds from the $105 billion request from President Biden. That includes funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and border security. So this bill was introduced by Senators Roger Marshall, J.D. Vance, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz. It would provide $10.6 billion for Israel through the Pentagon, $3.5 billion for the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, and $200 million to help protect U.S. diplomatic facilities. And this is on top of the $3.8 billion that Israel receives from the U.S. each year in military aid. So this is about the same amount that Biden requested, about $14 billion in that huge spending package that he's requested that includes the Ukraine, Taiwan, and all the other stuff. So these senators want to separate spending for Israel from Ukraine so additional military aid can be sent to Israel as quickly as possible. President Biden's request includes $61 billion for Ukraine, and that's designed to fund the war in Ukraine for a whole year. So Senator Marshall said in a statement, quote, "My colleagues and I firmly believe that any aid to Israel should not be used as leverage to send tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Any package that does so would result in funds and resources being delayed in Israel's time of need. The legislation we've introduced provides the aid to Israel requested by the Biden administration and should be considered by the Senate immediately," end quote. So the U.S. has already shipped additional military equipment to Israel using funds that they had and deployed all that firepower to the region. So the brutal Hamas massacre on October 7th was preceded by months of warning signs noted by IDF surveillance soldiers and disregarded as unimportant by intelligence officials, according to eyewitness accounts given in recent days. At least 3 months prior to the attack, surveillance soldiers serving on a base in Nahal Oz reported signs that something unusual was underway at the already tumultuous Gaza border, situated a kilometer from them. So the activity reported by the soldiers included information on Hamas operatives conducting training sessions multiple times a day, digging holes and placing explosives along the border. According to reports of the soldiers, no action was taken by those who received the reports. So essentially, this is more evidence that the Israeli government did receive warnings that something was coming, and that they didn't take any action to prevent it. The Egyptians said that they warned them something big was coming, and now we have this. And this is Israeli media, and if you read Israeli media, I read the English language versions, but you have Haaretz, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post. They are all very critical of the Netanyahu government for this attack and everything. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The new government of Slovakia has followed through with its campaign pledge to terminate arms transfers and is calling on the rest of Europe to adopt Slovakia's policy. Slovakia's new leader, Robert Fico, has called for the European Union to take on a peacekeeper role in the Ukraine war, and Slovakia will not support further sanctions on Moscow. So he told members of Slovakia's legislature on Thursday that Slovakia was abandoning the West's proxy war against Russia. He said, quote, "I will support zero military aid to Ukraine. An immediate halt to military operations is the best solution we have for Ukraine. The EU should change from an arms supplier to a peacemaker," end quote. So significant that a NATO member has a government that is all in on cutting off Ukraine completely and not playing the game at all. He also said that Slovakia would not support sanctions, And the question is if that's really going to have an impact on the EU sanctions and stuff.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And World War III already began with the Ukraine war. Oh, the Ukraine war is out of the news. Fuck the Ukrainians. Who cares about them? Nobody cares. Began with that. So now you got the Ukraine war that's still going on. Several million refugees that fled Ukraine, their lives destroyed. And I've been warning over and over again, when all else fails, they're also going to do a false flag event or attack a nuclear power plant, do something to that effect, so Ukraine gets back in the news. Again, when all else fails, they take you to war. And the global economy is failing. High borrowing costs pose threat to resilient economy. Well, this is in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Treasury route deters companies from borrowing as finance costs soar. Yeah, no shit. You ready? UN report says global economy could be heading for systemic crisis. The latest UN Trade and Development report presents a picture of a global economy wrecked by lower investment, again, high interest rates, and growth, the increased domination of giant corporations, the big zone everything, all you are plantation workers of Slavelandia, financial speculation, a falling share of labor income, and rising social inequality. Again, all old news. All old news that we have been forecasting on and on and on. Oh, this is from the Financial Times. Shanghai and Shenzhen stocks dropped to pre-COVID lows as growth fears intensify. No fucking shit. At 3 years of zero COVID policy, they destroyed the lives and livelihoods of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in China. And it's global, as the reports are showing. Oh, the NASDAQ now? Oh, it's in correction territory. It's down over 10%. The worst is yet to come. And that's why you subscribe to the Trends Journal. Today's New York Times, or Tuesdays, excuse me. Developing world accuses West of double standard over Gaza and Ukraine. Gaza deaths rise as anger flares in UN speeches. Look at the slaughter. U.S., now this is very important because it goes back to your top trends for 2023, Middle East meltdown, where we said they're going to drag Iran into this. And if Iran gets into this, it's going to be the end of life on earth. It's going to be World War III escalated into a nuclear war. U.S. moves to deter Iran from entering conflict ahead of Israel's Gaza invasion. So it's okay for Israel to invade Gaza. And the U.S. is using Israel's blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's a warning, right? U.S. may target Iranian crude. Strategist. Washington is likely to tighten crude oil sanctions against Iran over Iran's alleged support for Palestinian militant groups in Hamas. The head of global commodity strategy at RBC Capital's Markets, Helma Croft, has said. Talking on CNBC, Croft suggested that the West and the Biden administration would, quote, at a minimum, curb Iranian energy exports. The argument is you can continue to allow Iran to keep the bank open for groups like Hamas. No, that's what she says, yep. Blinken warns Iran as militants backed by Tehran stage attacks. Today's Wall Street Journal, front page. Again, what we're giving you, nobody's giving you anywhere else. All things are connected. Opportunity misses those who view the world through the eyes of their profession. We look at things for the way they are, not the way we want them to be. I'm telling you, Mideast meltdown has begun, and they're ramping up the war against Iran. Weapons flood West Bank, fueling fears of new war front. You ready? Tehran and its allies operate a smuggling network that crosses hundreds of miles and at least 4 borders, spew out Sunni Angla Ramusin and Banat Fulkan. Yeah, fuck you, Khan. Who the fuck are you to say this shit? Oh, we're repeating the crap that they shoved down our throats, Salenti. We're prostitutes. We're media whores that get paid to put out by our corporate pimps and our government whore masters. Because we're war whores on parade. Then you go on top of that. You ready? Here it is. Take a look. Hamas fighters had trained in Iran before Israel attacked. You see where this is leading? And again, you are not allowed to say anything contrary to the shit coming out and the shitheads in charge, like that arrogant fucking prick over there in Florida, the DeSantis. Yeah, the little fucking warmongering DeSantis. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis bans pro-Palestinian student organizations. The state university system in Florida said on Tuesday that it would dismantle chapters of the Students for Justice of Palestine. You got to get all those Jewish folks down in Florida, huh? As you're failing to run in the presidential election and even getting close to Trump. Dump. This is the fuck that was down in Guantanamo that kept that going over there. You like murder, don't you? Where is your soul? Where is your spirit for peace? As I said, when all else fails, they take you to war, and you're watching it fail in front of us. The future's in your hands. Don't drop it. It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men since Samuel Adams. And we're that irate, tireless minority. United we stand, divided we die.
We feel that one thing we could do is look at people that claim to be speaking rationally when in fact they are advocating for profiteering without even disclosing it. The legacy media should not be showcasing the voices of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin without telling you plainly that's what they're doing. I would say more important than their opinion on how this crisis should be handled is what their relationship is with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, considering that these organizations spend millions lobbying and earn billions bombing. At no point did MSNBC mention that Bash, who served as chief of staff at the Central Intelligence Agency in the Department of Defense in the Obama administration, leads a consulting firm that has reportedly worked for defense contracting giant Raytheon, which supplies missiles for Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Remember, if you have a strong affiliation to Israel, if you are Israeli, if you are Jewish, I am not saying that you don't have the right to your emotional experience right now. Who the hell am I to comment on that? Where I do feel qualified to pontificate is should Jeremy Bash, former CIA head, current member of consulting firm that reportedly works with Raytheon, be pretending to be, well, not even neutral, offering advocacy without declaring profiteering, which I think, if you take away your personal alliances, has informed almost every conflict in the last 100 years, and perhaps is the primary motivation for all wars. There is enough historic complexity in that region without the intercession of profiteering, without a legacy media not declaring their true motivation, true alliances, and where they're getting their information from. The episode is part of a broader recurring pattern in corporate TV news. In recent weeks, MSNBC, NBC, CNN, and Fox News have regularly invited on former defense officials turned industry consultants to explain the conflict between Israel and Palestine without ever mentioning to viewers that these analysts may represent clients with a financial stake in matters being discussed. Wouldn't you want to know if you were being offered a solution to a problem that the person that's offering you that solution has a vested interest in a particular outcome?
If you have 3 Pepsis and drink 1, how much more refreshed are you?
Pepsi?
Partial credit.
Doesn't it make you consider more broadly that America's role in the world is supplying weapons, often to both sides of a conflict, that you have people in Congress investing in weapons firms during this conflict, the legacy media have people that work for weapons firms talking to you during the conflict? Do you think that's helping us to get an unbiased assessment? As we try to tiptoe through this tragedy, that lives are being lost continually, unnecessarily, certainly it doesn't appear to be leading to a solution, one might argue. Don't you want to ensure that the information you're getting is the best possible information from the best possible people? How else are we ever going to achieve anything other than endless ongoing war? Endless ongoing war. I wonder if anyone would benefit from an endless ongoing war. I wonder if our intensity and willingness to take sides would benefit any of these interests that sell arms all around the world, often to both sides, turn up on your TV set advocating for war without declaring those investments, have a Congress full of people that are supposed to be representing you while investing in those weapons companies, having accepted lobbying money from those weapons companies while they work within a party that accepts donations from those weapons companies. That seems to me like a 360 dome that's worth interrogating. On October the 12th, Fox News interviewed Beacon managing director and partner Michael Allen, who served as a top National Security Council official under President George W. Bush. CNN also interviewed Beacon senior counselor Leon Panetta, who served as CIA director and Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. While we are all good as tribalized creatures with a deep, long history, perhaps longer than we ever imagined or history reports, have lived with natural alliances with groups that that we feel affiliation because our survival and their survival are completely entwined. It's clear from that little list that whether you're Republican or Democrat, pro-Bush or pro-Obama, left or right, there's a little group of intersecting, crossing over folks making a lot of money and making a lot of noise, generally advocating for further conflict on either and both sides, porously moving between media, defense, government, corporatization, effortlessly and endlessly. Meanwhile, down here in the dirge, we all sort of wave flags and squabble with one another about particular advocacy. And as I've said many times, I understand that if you are personally affected by this, of course, I'm in no position to judge your alliances. I wouldn't dream of it. But surely we can agree that having a system where people profiteer and sit in different chairs, in different hats, advocating usually for more war and more expenditure isn't the best way to solve these heartbreaking global problems. Neither Fox nor CNN noted it was interviewing executives at Beacon and chose only to identify them by their former government titles. If your partner brought someone around there and said, oh, this is my sister's friend Derek, and didn't mention that they had had a long-lasting love affair with Derek, I'd say, you mentioned that it was your sister's friend. What you didn't tell me is that you had a long relationship with them. Why was that? Is it because you maybe thought that that would bias my impression of that person if you'd given us that one bit of information? Yeah, I thought I would keep that back. Let's not make this about that I would have with Derek, my sister's friend Derek. Telling you that someone's a government official and not mentioning that they've got strong ties to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin seems like a pretty deliberate choice to me, doesn't it? So let's follow that line. Right, they didn't tell us that. Why? Oh, because then we'd think that the information they was giving us was biased towards spending more money on like Raytheon products and Lockheed Martin products. What does that mean more generally? Oh, well, they benefit from war. Right, so in conflict situations, what type of attitude are they going to take? Probably like a pro-war stance. Right, so what should we make sure we include in our analysis of the situation? The potential that the war's not actually for the reason that they're saying it is probably for another reason, potentially for another reason. And finally, what the hell are we going to do about Derek? Forgive him? NBC's Israel news coverage has also relied on executives at West Exec Advisors, a defense industry consulting firm that was founded by former Obama administration officials, including Antony Blinken, who now serves as Biden's Secretary of State. Do you see a theme developing? Do you see what's happening here? Again, if you are connected to the loss of life in Gaza or the loss of life in Israel, you are in a tragic situation that I do not feel qualified to comment upon. But having people moving between administrations, moving between agencies, advocating for bombing, same as the free speech argument in a way, isn't it? Sometimes people go, do you know what we should do? Censor people that are saying something that I disagree with. And once in a while you think, yeah, I'd love people. Do you know what I'd like to see censored? People attacking me. I wish people would censor that. But actually, free speech is more important to me because it's a principle. It's a principle. The whole problem that we have in the world right now is no one's got any values. No one's got any principles. Not when it comes to the top strata of governing the world. They will mouth the words of principles and values, but meanwhile, undisclosed connections to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Without transparency, without clarity, without a legacy media with values and principles, and let's face it, we don't have one, we're never going to navigate our way through this treacherous swamp.
Schiff Show. If you recall, if you were following me back in the day, back in 2008, when a lot of people started following me, one of the many reasons that I was against the bailouts, the bank bailouts, the TARP program, was that I knew that if we bailed out these too big to fail banks, that the next time we had to bail them out, they would be even bigger. So if they're too big to fail, then let's let them fail. Because why keep them alive so that they can get a lot bigger? So that when they fail in the future, it's even worse. Because if they were too big to fail in 2008, what are they now? Because all of those banks that we bailed out are much, much bigger now than they were then. And they're in much more trouble now than they are then, than they were then. And so at least they're writing about this. But they still don't get the severity of this. And it's not just the interest payments. It's the principal. It's not just that we can't pay the interest, but we have to pay the principal. You know, for years, people used to tell me, Peter, why are you worried about the debt? You know, we never have to pay that back. All that counts is the interest. We have to pay the interest, but we don't have to pay back the principal. In fact, if you ask most experts today, they'll say the same thing. We don't have to pay the principal. Well, my response to that was always, what do you mean we don't have to pay back the money? We borrowed it. It's a loan. I mean, that's the whole, nature of a loan, right? This isn't a gift that we got. The national debt wasn't a gift. It's debt. By its nature, debt has to be repaid. So when they would say we don't have to repay the debt, I would say, well, did you run that by the Chinese? Did you run it by the Japanese? Do they know that that's the deal? Do they know that they're loaning us money, but they're never going to get it back? Because, that's not a loan. That is a gift. They're not giving us this money. They are loaning it, and that means they expect to get it back. Now, of course, what people would tell me is, well, of course we will pay them back because we'll borrow it from somebody else. So in other words, it's a Ponzi scheme, right? So Bernie Madoff never had to worry about paying back money because he would get it from the next sucker who didn't realize it was a Ponzi scheme. Well, what happens when people realize it's a Ponzi scheme? They don't want to participate. And that's what's going on. Our creditors don't want to loan us more money to pay back the other creditors. That is what is happening. That is why bond yields are going up, because the people who own the bonds want their money back as they mature, and we can't find new buyers. Now, prices are moving down and yields are going up, and so we're enticing some buyers into the market, but there's not enough. And here is the problem. Because normally you would think, okay, if there aren't people willing to buy treasuries, well, the yields will go up, and then the higher yields will be an inducement to buy. But it doesn't really work that way, because in this circumstance, as interest rates goes up, that impedes the solvency of the United States. Because as interest rates go up, we need to borrow more money to pay that interest, which means the debt goes up. As the debt goes up, America becomes a worse credit risk. And it becomes even more likely that we have to create even more inflation to service that debt, let alone repay the debt. So higher interest rates don't actually make treasuries more attractive. They make them less attractive. That is a problem. This is a bottomless pit. This is a self-perpetuating collapse that we are witnessing that is going to gather momentum. So what's happening is we have to pay back the principal, the money that we've owed, because we can't find people. We have very short maturities on the national debt. And this goes all the way back to President Clinton. You know, I was listening to Sean Hannity interviewing the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Jordan, right, who's now the Speaker. We finally have the Speaker of the House. And he was talking to Mike Jordan, and Mike Jordan was talking about the Trump economy. And he said that, you know, when Donald Trump was president, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world, right? That is the lie that I think will win Trump re-election. I mean, that's what the Republicans are going to say. Maybe some of them actually believe this. But we didn't have the greatest economy in the history of the world. I mean, it wasn't even close. I mean, we didn't even have the greatest economy in the history of America. We didn't have the greatest economy in the 21st century. We had a bubble under Trump. Trump didn't create the bubble. He inherited the bubble, and he made it bigger. That bubble is now popped under Biden. That's what's happening. You know, most likely, had Trump been reelected, it would have popped on his watch. Who knows, right? But this was inevitable. But the origins, really, of this bubble go back to Clinton. It goes back to the Greenspan era, although Greenspan was there before Clinton. But the big monetary policy mistakes took place starting in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. And the bubble initially popped when George Bush came in, George W. Bush. And then that's when we started even more reckless policies, because that's when we had the TARP and we got the bubble even bigger with all the quantitative easing that took place mainly under the Biden presidency. You know, so Trump came in there for 4 years, but during those 4 years, he didn't do anything to change the dynamics. The deficits got bigger under Trump. The trade deficits hit new record highs. We increased government spending. Yes, the Fed ratcheted up interest rates somewhat, but all that stopped, of course, when COVID hit. But Trump wasn't the game changer. He kept the game going. That's all he did. Now, in the scheme of things, was Trump less bad than Obama? Was he less bad than Biden? Yes, he was. But, you know, less bad ain't going to cut it. We actually need a good president, not a president who's less bad than the alternative. But the idea that people think that everything was great just a few years ago and it's all gone to hell, that's wrong, because that assumes that we can just fix it. Really simple, right? We just have to go back to the Trump policies and we're going to be great again. No. This problem is much bigger than just the bad things that Biden has done. But going back to Clinton, it was his Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin. He's the guy that started shortening the maturity of the national debt, meaning that the government would borrow not for 30 years, but 90 days, 1 year, shorter maturities. Why did Rubin do that? Well, it was to make the deficits look smaller. Remember, Clinton was trying to balance the budget. And for a couple of years, you know, with sleight of hand accounting, they did manage a balanced budget. Of course, the national debt actually went up every year that the budget was supposedly balanced, because they didn't count a lot of the spending as part of the official budget. But one of the ways that they brought down the deficit was by reducing the interest expense on the national debt. And how did they do that? They did that by refinancing the debt from longer to shorter maturities, because the shorter maturities had lower interest payments. That's the same thing a lot of Americans did with housing. They took adjustable rate mortgages. They got teaser rates because the rates were lower. Now, of course, the trade-off was risk that eventually rates could go up. But politicians will make that trade-off, because the trade-off that Rubin made with Clinton was that, yes, in the long run, this is bad for the country because we should be locking in these low interest rates. And in the long run, rates are going to go up. But that's somebody else's problem, because, you know, Clinton won't be in office when this bomb explodes. So in the meantime, let's have a short-term financing of the debt. And it'll be the next president's problem when interest rates went up. Well, when Bush became president, he did the same thing. He shortened the maturity. When Obama became president, he shortened the maturity. And Trump did the exact same thing. While he was president, he didn't take advantage of the low interest rates to try to lengthen the maturity of the national debt. He actually continued the politically expedient but long-term disastrous policies of making that deal with the devil, of shortening the maturities, knowing that the bomb would blow up in the future. And that's what's happening right now on Biden's watch. Now interest rates are soaring, and all that short-term debt that we've been taking on for 20 years, now it's maturing, and we have to roll it over at 525, 550 basis points. We could have locked it in years ago for 30 years at 200 or 300 basis points, but we didn't do that because it was cheaper to finance it at 25 basis points, but now we're paying the price, and it's going to escalate into this complete sovereign debt and currency crisis, which has already started, but is a long way from ending.
Here first from Thomas Jefferson in his opinion against the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's horrible national bank in 1791. He said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people." This was 10 months to the day before ratification of the Bill of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson is hammering home that he sees the 10th Amendment as the foundation, the structure of the entire Constitution. What is not delegated is automatically reserved. Now, there was a big reason why this structure of delegated and reserved powers was so important, was so foundational, not just as an add-on, but to the entire structure of the document. It's actually our legal rule of construction. It tells us how to read the entire Constitution. The Ninth Amendment is one as well. But the reason is that so many in the founding generation, a vast majority, of course there were outliers like Alexander Hamilton, but a vast majority of the founders, the framers, the founding generation saw consolidation or centralization of power as a massive threat to the liberties of the people. Patrick Henry thought it was the greatest danger, and he railed against consolidation over and over and over in the Virginia ratification debates in June of 1788. Here's a couple of quick examples. June 5th. There's one thing in it which I never would acquiesce in. I mean, the changing it into a consolidated government, which is so abhorrent to my mind. Just absolutely abhorrent is the idea of consolidation. And on June 7th, he said, "Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive." And he said also, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. He said it's absolutely guaranteed. Mike Maharrey put it this way, quote, "If consolidation ends in the destruction of our liberties, as Patrick Henry put it, the key to regaining liberty is unconsolidation, or to use an actual word, decentralization, the system of federalism that is reinforced or affirmed by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution for these United States." John Taylor of Caroline, the great Jeffersonian, in Construction Construed and Constitutions Vindicated, 1820, the whole thing will be linked to, you can read it, that'll be in the show notes, pointed out that this is the way you secure or preserve liberty. He said, "The preservation of liberty must depend on the division of power between the state and federal governments, or an accurate distinction between the powers bestowed and reserved." And I know I'm citing a lot of Virginians here, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Taylor of Caroline, but it wasn't just the Virginians, and I know I mentioned John Jay as well. Up in Massachusetts, ratification in early 1788 was almost certainly going to fail. And if it failed in Massachusetts, it was probably going to fail in New York, New Hampshire, Virginia. The Constitution would have been dead in the water. They had done they were whipping votes, and they were tallying up, and the votes against were pretty solidly in the lead. So Federalists, primarily people like Theophilus Parsons, Rufus King, and a few others, they worked out a deal with John Hancock and Samuel Adams. We know that John Hancock was probably drafting some proposed amendments to the Constitution pretty early on, even before the ratifying convention in Massachusetts. And so the proposal and the strategy was, okay, we'll agree to ratify, but we're going to recommend amendments, and you are going to agree because, we are brothers in arms. You're going to agree to go along with this. And maybe we won't get all of these amendments, but if we start this process and all the other states start doing this, we're going to end up with amendments to the Constitution or a Declaration of Rights. And actually, in many cases, probably some people wanted both. Now, here's the absolute number one thing that Massachusetts recommended for ratification. And mind you, we know, and there are some letters discussing this in 1789, when there was a delay by the Federalists to actually propose the amendments, we know that everyone was aware that the Constitution probably would not have succeeded had it not been for this approach. So Hancock's first one, well, we'll call it John Hancock's, was this. First, that it be explicitly declared that all powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved to the several states to be by them exercised. So without that recommended amendment, a precursor, it's not obviously the exact same thing, it's based more on the Articles of Confederation, without saying there's delegated and reserved powers and there's a clear line in the sand, the Constitution wouldn't even exist, most likely. It probably would not have passed, so that's incredibly important. That was in February of 1788, and then in June, New Hampshire used the exact same language. And the number one thing for their ratification was also that it be explicitly declared that all powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved to the several states to be by them exercised. In New York, they had a very similar approach. They had their version of a precursor to the 10th Amendment, number 3, but it ties in very closely because it is about delegating reserved powers. And if power flows from the people, they're delegating. It ties in with their first one as well. Let me read it all to you here. That all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people, and that government is instituted by them for their common interest, protection, and security. And so then the third on that list is, these are their recommended amendments when they ratified in July of 1788. That every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments of the government thereof, remains to the people of the several states or to their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. So in New York was also a very close vote, even after Massachusetts. It may have lost there if they weren't able to recommend amendments. And right close to the top, if not very top, depending on how you read this, is another precursor to what became the 10th Amendment. June 26, 1788. First, that each state in the Union shall respectively retain every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Constitution delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of the federal government. That's the first amendment that Virginia recommended in their ratification document, June of 1788. North Carolina used the same text in their approach the following year. In South Carolina, they're a little wishy-washy. They only include their kind of 10th Amendment precursor second when they ratified. They said, this convention doth also declare that no section or paragraph of the said Constitution warrants a construction that the states do not retain every power not expressly relinquished by them and vested in the general government of the Union. Now, closing it out here, I think John Hancock has a great statement. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. He pointed out that it is the reserved powers of the people that can keep them free. Now, of course, it's up to the people to use those powers that have been reserved to them, people of the several states, to use the powers reserved to them in ways that support the Constitution and liberty instead of how they've been using it for generations and generations, and that is in support of more and more federal power.
This, I think the big question is, will he move us toward runaway inflation, or do you think he will lead us to a balanced budget? But just what are your thoughts economically about what's going on and what it might be like, with the new speaker?
But I think the situation is very tough, regardless of who holds the position of Speaker. Johnson's proposed taking up individual bills between now and November 17th. That's when the current funding expires. He said another stopgap measure, known as a continuing resolution, might be needed to prevent the Senate from jamming the House with a Christmas omnibus, referring essentially to a consolidated spending bill. He said a continuing resolution could have a deadline of January 15th or April 15th, depending on the consensus in the GOP. But a continuing resolution is just more of the same at the end of the day. Maybe a continuing resolution is better than an omnibus bill, but either way, I think it's time to start getting back to the way government budgets are supposed to be crafted. It's that simple, and we're still not there yet. So I think it's more of the same. We've got to start focusing on a plan for sustainable debt reduction, just not overspending, and we're a long way away from that, it feels. And we're getting to the point of no return, and we talk about the costs of spending, and the costs of spending are real. In fact, debt service costs rose 33% this year from last. Now, just the interest payments on our debt alone are similar to our defense budget, which dwarfs that of every other nation combined in the top 10, for some context. So it's becoming problematic, and it's starting to compound. We borrowed $2 trillion last year. 700 billion of that was just for debt service payments. It's obscene.
Yes, there's getting back to the Fed, because I can't think of deficits or how big government is and why they're doing it without talking about the Fed, because that's really the engine that keeps this and perpetuates it. And as long as there's belief in the Fed and fiat, things will limp along, and we're doing actually better than I would have predicted if we could print all this money that we have. But I think most of us realize that this can't last. Even the Fed has said, oh well, this can't last. And there was an article here that I clipped, and the headline is, what can the Fed do about the deficit? And the conclusion was nothing. They can't do anything about it. And the longer I was in Congress, I got the same message from the Fed, because I was always on the banking committee. And when I present a question to them, about the spending, they say, oh, and even this week the chairman said, oh, we don't talk about finances and spending. We separate ourselves. And what I want to suggest that there's a reason for this, and see if I can get your opinion on this. And that is that they're worried worrying about, the loss of independence. They talk about independence. And there's the other one on Zero Hedge says, dollar's fate is sealed as the Fed's independence is eroded. And well, maybe credibility is being eroded, but independence isn't there. They're always saying the Fed's over here independent, and they always, anytime I ask them this question, they always say it's Congress's fault. They spend too much money. They put the pressure on us to do this. And I wonder about the theory, Philip, about maybe this is not exactly that way. Maybe they know exactly what they're doing. Maybe they work together. Maybe they're in collusion and saying, spend and go ahead and support the empire. We'll take care of it. Where do you come down on that theory?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it that the Federal Reserve at times has certainly acted in a political manner, and it seems to be the case that they sort of cry independence when people look at collusion, and it's clear to others that I think there are elements of that, but the Federal Reserve, I think, in on itself is a big problem.
Yes, and the statistics on inflation right now, they're not real good. Even this morning, it came out from the Michigan study, and it was much higher than expected. So at times the government, fudges those figures too. Those nominal figures, aren't reliable. And have you sensed that people sort of look away from there? They have to deal with what they'll do to the market, but they really don't believe that we get accurate information from the government, even on economic statistics.
I think everybody I speak to at least is fully aware of that. I mean, the government are suggesting headline inflation is at 3.7%. Anybody who goes to a grocery store understands it's not our reality. And I tell people, if you just calculate inflation in the same way the government did in the 80s, it would put it closer to 13% today. So the public aren't fooled, and the reality is we're feeling it, right? Wage inflation is trailing actual inflation. We're seeing credit card debt spiral. We're now starting to see defaults. The American people can't be fooled by numbers because we feel the reality.
A couple words about your assessment of Bidenism. You put in a fancy word, it must be a fancy program. And, it came out with a burst, but I think even those who proposed it aren't bragging so much anymore. But give us your opinion about what all that is. What really were they aiming for, and where do you think it's going to end?
Did you say Bidenism? I misheard. Sorry.
Bidenism, Biden's programs. He came out and had all this program, and because there was a fancy word on there, it was a solution to our problem. Deficits don't hurt. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's nonsense. For me, it's a cynical attempt to buy votes. I think we're overspending at a time when we clearly shouldn't be overspending. As I mentioned before, the spending itself in large part has been very wasteful, right? Biden was pushing to pay off student loans, right? Think about that as a concept. We're carrying more debt today than any nation has ever held in history, and we think it's a priority to start paying off student loans. I mean, the whole concept is counterintuitive, and that's why I say the cynic in me thinks this is just a desperate attempt. We're in debt. Why not just rack up more debt and try and buy ourselves another 4 years? It feels literally like that.
And a lot of times people say prices are up. But the reason I point this out is you can't blame the businessman's profits, or you can't blame labor costs going up and saying that's inflationary. The labor prices are going up, and that's going to cause everything to go up. And yet that is a price that has an effect on the monetary system and the monetary policy of our governments.
Very clear. Government spending leads to aggressive inflation, and we're spending at a rate that has never been seen before in history. And what's so concerning is those in Washington don't seem to understand the gravity of the actions. And now we look at what's happening globally with the dollar. We are incentivizing countries around the world to dump the dollar. And this is where this stuff becomes very dangerous. Look, at some point, we'll iron out this inflation. We'll deal with bubbles in the economy. We lose a grip on global reserve currency. No nation has ever regained that in history, and that's where a presidential term, in my mind, can become very dangerous.
Yeah. If you need information, the founders had it. They tried to get us into the right direction. We did it for a while, but we've gone in the wrong direction. That's why the information, Philip, that you're talking about is very necessary. We have to follow up, and I encourage people to check it out. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
How are we supposed to have grasped the universals prior to birth? By what means? Seems to be the idea that we saw the perfect man, but how do you see freedom? Well, a perfectly good question, only you make a certain concession here. You think, well, it's easy enough to see the perfect man, but remember, the perfect man is manness, and that's not physical. It doesn't have a head, it just has headness, and so on. So it's a perfectly good question, there's no answer to it. All that Plato's epistemology does is move the question of how you acquire knowledge of concepts back one step. You can't get them in this life, you got them in another. But then the question is, how did you get them in the other? And Plato simply says, you got them somehow. Now, this is always true of reversions to supernaturalism. It's the same exact principle applies to the question, where did the world come from? And people think, well, we got an answer if we say it came from God. But then, of course, the question is, where did God come from? And you're back where you started. Supernaturalism explains nothing. And therefore, Plato has commonly been criticized on the grounds that his theory does not answer the question it's designed to answer. How does Plato account for the fact that particular men are not omniscient if all men are born knowing everything? Well, partly because the knowledge is born in your unconscious. And therefore, a complex process is required to dig it out. It doesn't simply surface by itself. That's Plato's epistemology, how you acquire this knowledge and make it real. But the point is a complex process is required. It doesn't just pop up by itself. And it's a process of such a nature that if you are interested in the physical world and physical pleasure, you simply won't perform it. You'll turn away from that process and instead concentrate on money and sex and things like that, and so you'll remain ignorant all your life. But if you follow Plato's epistemology and ethics, you will one day hit the jackpot and know everything. You can't miss it. The question, by the way, for those who didn't hear, how does a philosopher know he's seeing the ultimate form when he actually does? Well, the answer of the whole Platonic tradition is the experience you have when you get it is so overwhelming, so revolutionary, so soul-penetrating that no one could possibly be mistaken. Now, you know, for instance, the Hollywood movies about when you're in love, bells go off. Well, that is nothing compared to what goes off when you hit the form of the good. Yes, I agree with Plato's distinction between belief and knowledge, although not the Platonic interpretation of that as reflecting two different dimensions. I agree that you have to know why in order to call something knowledge. You have to be able to prove that it must be so on the basis of fact. It does not, however, follow that the Greeks couldn't be certain that the sun would rise or that man was mortal, because the question is, what do you take as a proof? What do you take as an answer to the question, why? And here the crucial objectivist point is knowledge is contextual. You can be certain within the context of a certain amount of knowledge and proceed to expand your knowledge accordingly when more evidence comes in. You do not have to know the latest discoveries from biology to know that man is mortal. And you do not have to know the Newtonian theory of the heavens in order to know that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, if you have further questions on the conditions of certainty and of the nature of an explanation, in part I will cover them when I present Aristotle's view of explanation, and in part I will say something on this subject in Lecture 12 in connection with the general subject of how can you attain certainty. Does Plato hold that there are no degrees of truth, only no knowledge or omniscience? Ultimately, he does hold that. Either you know everything or you know nothing. If you use knowledge in its strict sense, you either know the form of the good or you don't. If you don't, then of course you have probability, you have hypotheses, you might have whole worked out systems, but they're hanging in the air. And in that sense, you don't have true knowledge. But of course, he makes a distinction between a scientist who wouldn't know the form of the good and yet have an awful lot of accumulated data about the unreal world, and an awful lot of probable hypotheses about the forms versus a baby. So in that sense, he makes a cognitive distinction of sorts. How does Plato know that the ultimate form is the good, not the bad? That's a good question. Well, that's a good question, to which there's no answer. The only thing you can say is this. If you are going to be a universal teleologist at all, and of course I tried to indicate the reasons for it, it is infinitely healthier to be a Platonic type than the opposite type. Now, there is the opposite type, but again, it couldn't have developed until the 19th century, and that was Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer holds that everything happens for a wicked purpose. He is what's called a metaphysical pessimist. He believes that the goal of everything is to make life as miserable as possible, and that the thing to do, therefore, is collectively for human beings to sacrifice everything and hopefully extirpate the entire universe. A typically 19th century thought. Compared to that, Plato is just a benevolent life lover.